on Earth by 2030. As I said, nobody can be a passive bystander. This is about the fate of each and all of us in the future. And because this change happens and must happen at all levels and systemically, it's not just about the health. It's not just about global systems and structures. It's not just about the body. It's not just about our actions, although our actions are critically important. It's also about the soul and about the spirit and about who and what we are. And that's why in our deliberations today, we are going to have all sorts of people, ranging from former heads of state, as you'll hear from in just a moment, to some of the world's most renowned performers, as you will also hear from in not too long, to incredibly inspiring students and refugees and others. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment for humanity. The only way we're going to address the challenges we face is together, and that means empowering each and all of us to drive and be the change we need. And because this change begins in the deepest part of the self, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and the One Shared World
in Bali.
Om Swastiastu. I am Gusti Sudarto from Bali, Indonesia. In this moment, I would like to say we can go through pandemic peaceful with love and compassion. We must together because we are in one sky, one earth, and one humankind. Rahayu. Om Santi, 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 Om.
Jayangkan maha swarga loka eka catreng sarirong repi ananing burbuah sua.
Wow. If that doesn't wake us all up, I really don't know what will. Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you so much, Pak Gusti. Again, change has to happen at all levels, and it starts in the deepest parts of each of us, but it culminates in changes to the global systems that surround us. And that leads us, I think, quite appropriately into our next conversation, which is looking at the big picture. How can we solve our global collective action problem? And we need to look at this from two ways, both in looking at individual manifestations where there's a global challenge that we can't quite solve, pandemics, public health, climate change, global systemic poverty and inequality, and many, many others. We also need to recognize that our world is not yet sufficiently organized to solve this entire category of problems. I can think of no better people to discuss this challenge than the people who I'm happy to introduce now. First, David Miliband, the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee and the former UK Foreign Minister. Kevin Rudd, the president of the Asia Society and the former Australian Prime Minister, in conversation with Gillian Tett, the editor-at-large of the Financial Times.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jamie. It's great to be here. And having heard some very inspiring words about the need for global cooperation in a world where we're all exposed to each other, we're now going to ask whether we have a governance system which is remotely suited for this. I imagine the answer can be probably summed up in one word pretty quickly, but we want to explain how and why. And as we've heard, I've got David Miliband, someone who was previously Foreign Secretary and is now grappling with the refugee problem, and Kevin Rudd, who was previously Australian Prime Minister and is an expert on Asian affairs, particularly China, US, Asia, Australia affairs. So let me start with you, David. How bad is a refugee problem today? I mean, it's one of the symbols of being a connected world. And do we have anything like the governance structures to deal with it that we need? And if not, if you were suddenly put in charge of the entire world with a magic wand, what exactly would you do?
Thanks, Gillian. Great to be here with you and Kevin. The easy part of the question is how bad is the problem? We know there are 82 million people displaced by conflict and violence around the world. These are not economic migrants. They're displaced because of a failure of politics. About 35 million of them cross borders, so they become refugees. Another 45 million of them are internally displaced within their own countries. Most of them are in poor countries, not in rich countries, 85 or 86% of them in poor or lower middle income countries. So the issue, the responsibility of hosting refugees is disproportionately borne by the poorest parts of the world, even if the media coverage would present crisis in America or in Europe as being the center of the global refugee issue. The governance problem is fundamental in policy and in politics. The policy problem is that the roots of the refugee crisis lie in conflicts that are being exacerbated rather than resolved. These are civil wars, of which there are many times more than during the Cold War, interestingly enough. The tools of diplomacy that were developed after the Second World War are not adequate to the civil wars that exist today. And then the treatment of the symptoms is a splintered and fractured system where many people don't get any help at all and too many people get only partial help. Just to skip to what do we do about it, there are two paths, one of which I don't recommend, which is new international treaties, an attempt at a new multilateral compact. I think that the essence of the discussions today come down to this point. Big change happens when there is government leadership, a business and NGO innovation, and mass mobilization. But the critical point is they don't have to happen in that order. Kevin and I have both been in government, and the truth about the modern world is that governments are running away from big problems rather than addressing them. And so instead of waiting for government leadership, I think we need business and NGO innovation, and we need mass mobilization. And the governments are going to have to be dragged towards the solutions rather than leading the way towards them.
Right. Well, mass mobilization is one of the things that this organization is very much aiming to try and deliver. Kevin, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you think that initiatives like One Shared World can create the kind of mass mobilization we need? Can these issues come from the private sector, or do we need to shake up the whole world order and create sort of new structures as well?
Thanks, Gillian. It's good to be with you and with David and One Shared World. The bottom line is we should not waste 1 minute of our time redesigning structures. This is like an exercise in Thomist theology in trying to reconstruct.
You might have to explain Thomist theology for the wider audience. Okay. We're not all as brainiac as you.
No, as in Thomas Aquinas, which is creating this perfect order and castles in the air. In Australia, we just describe all that as bull dust. The truth is the structures prior to 1945 didn't exist. After 1945, they do exist, however imperfect they are. What is missing is two sets of qualities. One is the galvanizing power of a good and driving idea. And the second is a group of leaders from states, large or small, to turn the idea in reality, driving it through the existing institutions of global governance. And my final point would be, Gillian, is that as David has correctly identified, governments in this third decade of the 21st century are notoriously risk averse, perhaps not through lack of courage, it's simply because of the nature of the fragmented natures of their own internal democracies and political systems. Therefore, David's core point about business leadership and civil society comes to the fore. If you do not have a global group, however small, handful of committed national leaders who are prepared to combine their political capital and drive a particular reform around a galvanizing idea through the machinery of global governance, then that's where civil society does need to step in and create, as it were, the momentum from below. It is therefore this cocktail of the idea, the group of political leaders, only a handful to make things happen, and then thirdly, in the absence of that, or perhaps in the presence of it, an underpinning societal movement, which actually gives it the juice and the energy and frankly the drive to move the dial over time.
Well, that's obviously what One Shared World is seeking to contribute to. But I'm curious, the structures set up after World War II that you referred to, Kevin, were essentially set up by the Western allies. Places like China were an afterthought. I think Australia was noticed, but China wasn't part of the G7, wasn't part of the Bretton Woods, wasn't part of these groups. Of course, in the subsequent decades, it has become much more involved. But do you think they're really fit for purpose, given the Western slant today, Kevin?
Well, where I partly disagree with you is that the Republic of China actually was a negotiator of both Bretton Woods and at the San Francisco Conference. After the Civil War in China in 1949, the Communist Party took over, and of course you then had a period of protracted absence of China from the table. But the broader point you make, Gillian, is absolutely right. That is, there were 50 nation states gathered together in San Francisco. Now there are 192 around the table of the General Assembly in New York. However, each of them have separately acceded to membership of the institution. The UN Charter itself, and even the International Covenant on Human Rights of 1948, these were drafted by, frankly, widely representative panels. The 48 Declaration was drafted not just by Eleanor Roosevelt, but by senior Chinese officials, senior Indian officials, and others as well. But the critical point of legitimacy is that the ensuing 142 member states all put their hand up to join this institution. And if you look carefully at the founding documents, they are not particularly, in my view, slanted towards a particular worldview. And therefore, I go back to my original point. These founding documents, we should thank all of our predecessors for having exerted blood, sweat and tears to bring them into being in the first place. and the institutions on which they're based are not perfect. They're not ideal reincarnations of the kingdom of heaven on earth, but they're workable, they're usable, they exist in a manner which nothing really existed prior to 1939, apart from the shambolic structures of the League. And prior to 1914, nothing existed at all. So the question becomes one again of the power of the idea, 4 or 5 heads of government, whoever they may be, to make things work in the system, who take it as part of their national mission statement to drive the multilateral system towards producing results. And David and I have seen where that's happened and where it's failed. And thirdly, to reinforce that with a community movement which gives it political energy and momentum on the ground.
David, I can see you nodding enthusiastically. I'd be interested to hear your comments on that. But also I'd like to ask you something else. You know, we have this body called the United Nations, which presumes that the nation state is the main functioning unit of governance. And yet we're living today in a world where nation states are often fracturing, often ineffective. And in many cases, you know, refugee problems are not about nation state, they're about local and other institutions. Do you think we need to widen our definition beyond the nation state?
Well, I was nodding because I think Kevin's making a really important point. The 1945 settlement, 2 very important points. The 1945 settlement, for the first time in human history, put the rights of individuals alongside the rights of states in international law and international norms. That was very, very important. And it's vital that we don't think we have to rewrite the laws and norms. We have to live up to the ones that exist. The second reason I was nodding is that he knows so much more about China than I do, but I do know there's a vigorous attempt among the current Chinese leadership to claim their share of the credit for the post-1945 settlement. And I think Rana Mitter has written a brilliant book about this recently, and from Oxford. And so this idea that somehow the 1945 settlement was this Western imposition, the truth is capitalist and communist, democratic countries and dictatorships all signed up to a set of commitments to individuals. But those commitments are not being met. There's never been a golden age. I don't look back to the Cold War as a golden age. But there was a moment in the early 2000s when the notion that an interdependent world had to take seriously communal responsibility was gaining ground. Over the last 15 years, that's been in headlong retreat. And that's the burden of the second part of your question. I think that there is a real importance in recognizing that the multilateral system, the global governance system, can't just be a multinational system. It can't be such, and a multinational system is one by definition that just involves nations. The multilateral system today must involve business and civil society, and it must involve regional and local government. Remember, California would be the 3rd biggest country in the world if it was a country by size of its economy. So the idea that the multilateral system ignores the Californias of this world, never mind the great cities of this world, seems to me to be foolish. And the future is not a simple multilateral grid. It's going to be a lot of overlapping networks. And my emphasis would be on coalitions of the willing. Let's get stuff done. Let's not try and think that 193 countries coming together to rewrite laws and norms is going to get things done.
Right. Well, that is a very inspiring note on which to throw back to Jamie. It really does frame very well the theme of the day. So thank you both very much indeed for that history lesson and that lesson in Thomas Aquinas, which I'm sure everyone has noted. And I hope that we'll be picking it up for the rest of today's discussion. So thank you. Sorry, Rachel, I'm throwing it over to Rachel. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you so much, David, Gillian, and Kevin Rudd, for this really, I think, important framing of the rest of the day. And to think that the future is not just a group of bilateral relations, but really a collective and a kind of coalition building, I think, is why we're all here. This program is really also recognizing the power of the arts, and I'd like to bring on Jackie Davis. We have been working on how do we make the kinds of changes that we care about and the importance that the arts can play in this. Over to you, Jackie.
Thanks, Rachel, and hi, everyone. When One Shared World was created about a year and a half ago, it was understood that arts and culture would be central to our efforts. What do arts and culture have to do with climate change, systemic poverty, sanitation, and clean water for all? Culture is the centrifugal force that embodies and inspires humanity in all of us. We're so proud to announce the incredible artists who have become global artists for One Shared World. They include Alan Cumming, Scottish actor, Arwa Gouda, Egyptian film star, Youssou N'Dour, Senegalese musician, Arturo O'Farrell, Latin jazz pianist and big band leader, and Sting, rock star. Now to you, Rachel, for the rest of the list.
Well, we also have Julie Taymor, the extraordinary director of film and theater, Lin Huai Min, the choreographer who has inspired so many of us from Taiwan, Charmaine Obey Chinoy from Pakistan, who has made incredibly inspiring films, the Kronos Quartet, in recognition of their One Shared World in terms of bringing new voices to the quartet, and of course, the extraordinary Renee Fleming. And we're really delighted to be able to invite Renee here. Thank you so much for being here, Renee. And we'll have a moment to talk a little bit about some of the extraordinary work that you have been doing. This has included the new recording that is about to come out, The Voice of Nature, the Anthropocene, which I think really captures both the challenges of the times that we're living in, and at the same time, the transformative power that I think music can bring us. And I'd love to hear from you, Renee, a little bit more about your vision on what is it that music and the arts can do that really in some ways other forms of communication can't.
Thank you, Rachel. It's great to see you and Jackie as well. So I kind of experienced this firsthand throughout my life of touring and meeting audiences where they are and seeing this power exhibited in how people respond to music, and it got me interested in neuroscience. So that's been the thing I think that's really taking up so much of my attention and passion at the moment. And one of the things I learned as I explore this intersection of science and the arts is that evolution is really the key. That music and the arts, whether in use of voice or drumming or any of these kind of tribal influences, have been an extraordinary driver of community for millennia now. I mean, for so much longer than recorded history. And we don't change that quickly. So that's one thing that's been very clear as well. And the thing that I think really works, that sparks empathy, that sparks change, and it's something, of course, we need a lot more of at the moment, is emotion. And emotion and memory are very strongly tied together, but that cathartic moment when we feel something that drives change and that drives us to do something together and to cooperate.
You have really focused on this idea of the Anthropocene, and I think so much of this is about the collective, and yet some of it is quite intimate, like the program you've been doing on breathing. So there's something that is both the intimacy of breath, which we all have, and the kind of transformative power that sharing music with a group of people has, as you've just stated.
Well, the Voice of Nature, this recording that I'm releasing in a couple of weeks, was spurred by the horrors of the pandemic, being at home, being grounded. All of us as artists and performing in the performing arts were completely grounded. And so many people were struggling out of work, not able to make ends meet. It's been a really tragic time for us, as well as for so many other people. And I think my saving activity was being out in nature, was walking, was being outside. I really wanted to be outside all day. I didn't want to come inside. It was almost an obsession with me. I started biking, etc. And so, and I think Mother Nature has our attention now. I mean, certainly the kind of catastrophic weather issues we're having in the U.S. have really just completely taken over the news for the most part in recent months. So I thought, what can we do as artists? And I always think about how powerful nature was in the 19th century in poetry. Every human condition, every human experience was framed through the lens of nature. Love, loss, tragedy, you name it. It was all nature. And so I thought, let's juxtapose that with our relationship to nature now. What's happening now? So we have 2 new commissions and 3 young composers on the album who really look at some of the issues that we're facing right now. And, I keep saying Mother Nature's been very good to us. We haven't been very good to Mother Nature. So we need to work on that. So that's that piece. But Healing Breath with Google Arts and Culture has really struck a chord. That was another way in which I thought, how can we help long COVID patients? And we singers are experts on breathing. It's what we train to do. It's what we're almost like swimmers in the sense that we have to have a sustained, controlled breath to do what we do. And so I just reached out to 14 friends and said, please share your breathing secrets. So, and sing a little bit so we can give some hope and some strategies to long COVID patients.
Thank you. Can we now hear you in a piece that has come from this new collection that will be out in a couple of weeks?
Yes. This is Yannick Nézet-Séguin playing the piano. He is the music director of the Metropolitan Opera, and we recorded this last April.
What's the upper limit of our human capacity to create beauty, to build a better world for everyone? I think Renee has shown us that there is no upper limit. It's about our imagination. It's about realizing our capacity as we build a better world. Thank you so much, Renee. Thank you, Rachel. And I think in many ways, that's a perfect segue into the next portion of our summit, where we're going to ask, how can we actually solve the biggest problems we face in some of the most critically important areas: pandemics and public health, climate change and global warming, systemic poverty and inequality. In each of these areas, we need to match the imagination, the striving, the drive to build a better world, as Renee and Gusti represent, with our ability to actually roll up our sleeves and solve problems. The first of these next sections will be our conversation on how do we solve the problem of pandemics within the context of addressing the great challenges of building a global public health infrastructure that works for everyone. Our player coach and conversant will be Professor Larry Gostin, University Professor at Georgetown, in conversation with Barbara Stocking, the former CEO of Oxfam and Cambridge University College president, Precious Metsoso, the former South Africa health minister, and the incomparable Soumya Swaminathan, the chief scientist of the World Health Organization. Larry?
Well, thanks so much, Jamie, and it's such a pleasure to be with you in One Shared World. And just listening to Renee, it was really full of love and inspiration. And we have to match that kind of love and mutual responsibility, respect for Mother Nature, admiration for Mother Nature, and ourselves as we face this pandemic. Jamie's asked me to moderate a panel. Can we learn from the pandemic's lessons, public health in an interdependent world? And so I'm going to just frame a few questions, and then I'll turn to our spectacular panel to really just have a conversation with each other and with you. So, what is the core problem to be solved? I mean, there are so many, but the core problem is, an unraveling of mutual solidarity, mutual cooperation. We seem to be, as individuals, too much geared toward, what does the world owe to me? Or as a nation, my nation first. And we forget that we have not just kind of rights as nations or individuals, but we have responsibilities. We have responsibilities to our family, our community, our country, our region, and our whole world to make it a better place. And that solidarity has broken down. We've seen it throughout the pandemic with the inequitable distribution of scarce medical resources. Fundamental things like personal protection equipment, oxygen, and now life-saving vaccines. Just yesterday, President Biden hosted a summit alongside the UN General Assembly on COVID-19, focusing specifically on vaccinations. By the same chance, the US FDA on the very same day yesterday authorized third Pfizer shots, or so-called boosters. And so we have to ask ourselves, is the Biden model of charitable donations from the rich to the poor all right? Yes, we absolutely need those donations, but in order to scale up vaccination so that everybody's protected, we need to empower regional hubs so we don't just wait for donations that may come or may not come, but everyone in the world can have the power to create their own medical resources. And for that, we need to transfer the technology and the know-how. So what's succeeded and what's failed? The great success, of course, is scientific cooperation that got us to a vaccine in record time, under a year, when the quickest we've ever done it before is 4 years for mumps. And our key failure, of course, has been a failure of national and political cooperation around the world. And the singular failure, of course, has been one of deep inequity, the haves and the have-nots, those who have died disproportionately, those who have not have access to life-saving vaccines. But out of a crisis comes opportunity, and there are many opportunities that are now before us for a better, as we say, one shared world. WHO is going to host a pandemic treaty negotiations in the next special session of the World Health Assembly in November. There is a attempt to reform the international health regulations. We need to empower the World Health Organization as our leading organization. We need to strengthen its partnerships like with COVAX. And most of all, we need bottom-up social mobilization and civil society voices to help lead this. I'm always inspired by the AIDS pandemic, where I think AIDS changed the world, and it was changed by the brave civil society advocates who literally required governments in the world to pay attention when they were not. And so now I want to turn to our panelists and, ask you for your views about, how can we get a deeper recognition of mutual responsibilities and a deep global interdependence to help us better address this challenge. And I think I might turn first to Soumya, who's, as chief scientist of WHO, has really been the singular voice of trust in science throughout the world. So why don't you begin, and then we'll bring in Precious and Barbara.
Thank you very much, Larry, and also for the framing that you've just done, putting all of the issues on the table. I must say that when I look back over the last 20 months, there are a lot of things that have, good things that have happened that we must acknowledge and try to build upon. Just a couple of examples. Early on, in February of 2020, we hosted the first global research forum, research and innovation forum, which brought together at that time physically about 400 scientists. We knew by then, of course, that this was a novel coronavirus because we had on January 11th the whole genome sequences of this novel virus on a publicly available database, the GISAID database. So I think that's a big change, that this was a pandemic in the era of whole genome sequencing and publicly available data. So we knew within weeks what the pathogen was. We, of course, then laid out a research roadmap, and since then have been engaged with thousands, literally thousands of researchers, scientists, doctors from around the world, meeting on a regular basis. Every week, these expert groups are meeting to update on the scientific knowledge, what we've learned, and of course, we're still learning so much about this virus. But in the first few months, it was really critical on a daily basis to update that information, initially coming out of China, clinical manifestations, what's happening with these people, what's the pathogenesis of the disease, what's the mortality rate, who's vulnerable, how do you protect, what are the treatments. This then led to, of course, clinical trials, and it led to a lot of absolutely unprecedented amount of research, collaboration, leading to the development of new tools, diagnostics, vaccines, and some therapeutics. I would say that this is a victory for science, is a victory for scientists who gave of their time and of their expertise so freely without waiting for anything. Everything has been out in the med archives and the bioarchive. Nobody's waiting, for glory in publications. So I think this kind of a mission approach can be used to solve some of our other big challenges, take tuberculosis or malaria or air pollution. We need to come together like this. I think it's unprecedented. Second, on the downside, of course, there was a huge proliferation of research, of description of varying quality. So you have, at the beginning, we were tracking on a daily basis the publications. A small team was able to do that. But in a few weeks, we could no longer keep up because you had hundreds of papers. And then you have on these archives things which are not vetted by the peer group. And so there's so much information out. You had the media picking up things even before they were peer reviewed and making headlines. And so then we had to start fighting this misinformation. At times it's just out of a lack of awareness of good science versus bad science. But at times it's disinformation campaigns as well. Anti-science, anti-vax movements that unfortunately are seem to get the ears of people and the eyeballs of people. So we were fighting the pandemic, but also the infodemic. Third, I think what happened was with the development of the tools, even though WHO from the beginning was talking about the need for a fair and equitable distribution and sharing from day one, from the time that we needed PPEs and masks and gloves and oxygen to vaccines, we've had a complete lack of global solidarity. In fact, it's been every country for themselves. And this is where I think the problem lies, because in a pandemic, you cannot solve the problem. And I think the same will apply to the other big existential threats that we face. We cannot solve it one city at a time or one country at a time. There has to be a global agreement. And this is, as you mentioned, the pandemic treaty that will be discussed in November. Member states need to come together and say, well, this is a global threat. This can arise in any country and it will spread throughout the world in no time. We know that we're all interconnected now. You cannot stop pathogens and viruses from spreading. How can we deal with this? How do we prevent it? How do we make sure that we have the best possible surveillance systems, that we're sharing data rapidly, openly? That's why we set up this new pandemic hub in Berlin. It's really all about data, information, and how to empower countries to use that data. And when we develop the tools, they should be treated as global public goods. They don't belong to any one company or one country. They need to be used to fight this disease. And you mentioned HIV/AIDS. We should have learned the lessons. We waited till 12 million people had died before antiretrovirals were made available to low-income countries. So we can talk more about equity, but this is the glaring things for me. On the one hand, so much of solidarity around the scientific community. They wanted to do the right thing. But when it came to political leadership, we don't see that commitment. Maybe it's coming now, but it's too little, too late, I would say. People are dying every day. Let's stop there.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've stated it exactly right, Soumya. The miracle of science and scientific cooperation and unselfishness was the best of our humanity, and the disinformation and the inequities was the worst side. Precious, I mean, we've talked about the AIDS pandemic and the COVID pandemic, and of course in South Africa, you've had both have been deeply burdensome, and South Africa has behaved inspirationally in many ways. I wonder if you could kind of reflect back to AIDS, what the lessons are that we might learn today, and what you'd like to see from your vantage point in Africa.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. South Africa is a very typical example of why something shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be that we have these inequities after we've had the HIV/AIDS experience. In fact, I call this terrible twins, the terrible twins of inequality and inequity combined. We've traveled the path of inequality, and we're also exposed to the inequities. And having traveled that, we kind of learned how best to deal with this. But I do not think that you've got complete solutions. My understanding is that no country is an island, and no country can do this alone. South Africa's response has been because of the collaborative initiatives of problem solving that we've seen. Collaborative initiatives between civil society, scientists, government. It is obviously not always possible to bring government on board, But if you set up mechanisms of coordination in the country, it works. We've seen it with HIV and AIDS, and we've also seen how an empowered community, empowered civil society can marshal forces and drive the solidarity movement. No country can do it without bringing on board scientists, civil society, and different actors, as well as a private sector. I think that we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity now to prevent the next pandemic by starting at community level. Let's build our communities. Let's empower them. Let's give them information so that they can help us. Pandemics start in communities and they will end in communities. So if we empower them, we're halfway there. I still am optimistic that this cup or glass is still halfway full. So let's deal with the empty half of the glass by resolving all of these issues. The global coordinating mechanism and governance is important. And the pandemic treaty is actually going to be a vehicle towards that. Let's invest in that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Precious. And social mobilization bottom up is really what AIDS stood for, the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And as I say, I do think it changed the world, and we need to do that now. Barbara, both Precious and Sumya have talked about a pandemic treaty. Why don't you I know you're the chair of the independent panel. I'm on your panel. Talk a little bit about, what you think, what's your vision for a safer, more resilient world?
Okay. Well, first of all, I agree so much with what you said at the beginning, Larry, and others about, the need for solidarity and trust across the world. But if I think, Larry, to just start with what exactly is the problem that the pandemic treaty is set up to solve? And if we go back into what happened in this pandemic, of course, one of the absolutely fundamental points about this is that we did not stop an outbreak from turning into a pandemic. We're not going to stop all outbreaks, but we certainly can, in working in the proper way, actually stop this moving to a pandemic. So what went wrong at the beginning? Well, clearly there was a lack of preparedness, and I don't just mean in public health surveillance systems or PPE, but actually I think there is something quite fundamental which relates back to what Precious was talking about, communities. There is not a great understanding of what happens when you move from an outbreak to an epidemic to a pandemic. People don't understand, and this includes governments, that's most important, the exponential nature of the pandemics taking place. In so many other areas, when you have a disaster, you deal with that then and there. Now, people looking at the beginnings of any pandemic will think, well, this is quite small, and that's exactly what happened with COVID here in 2020 in the February, when so many world leaders said we must just wait and see. And with exponential growth, you really can't wait and see. And I think the public also doesn't have a good understanding of that either, which is why that comes back to Precious's point about making sure the communities are informed about why things happen, really. But so we had poor preparedness, and especially from governments really understanding what you have to do to hold back a pandemic. As it got going, we found that the international health regulations, which are already a binding treaty, they weren't adhered to. So that was a problem. When WHO came out with early warning or the public health emergency of international concern, people did not do the things that they ought to have done, actually globally, but sometimes in individual countries too, to actually really take on the guidance of WHO. So why didn't they? What's going on? Well, the answer to that, which is in the treaty, is the idea that there should be compliance and there should be mechanisms that can actually monitor what countries are doing and whether they are adhering to proper good practice or to specific WHO guidance in that. And that's what the essence of a treaty is. It's to have compliance mechanisms actually built in, and for countries to allow people outside to come in and monitor them. And if something is not working, to really properly investigate and also take up the remedial measures that you need to do. Now, WHO has never been given the authority to do that. Even to enter a country, WHO has to ask for access. So this is a different way of operating, to say that we accept that we're not all going to do it right, each country, but we are prepared to accept outside people to come in and really look at what we're doing. Now, I won't go into lots of detail about, there are discussions about where a compliance mechanism should sit. Is it in WHO? Is it into a new body that might report in more to the UN? But it's the essence of that point that's absolutely key in this. But the final bit I just want to say is, well, why should governments go along with this? Governments see health as part of their sovereignty. Of course, that's right. Looking after your own people is one of the first things a government has to do. But as we all know and has been said, we can't look after our own people if we're not looking after the world. And I guess what I really hope is that this time it has been understood that people can't stand alone in their own country and just actually do what they individually think is right, when it's often against the scientific advice and so on. But we have to really work together and understand that we are in solidarity and need each other, both actually even now as we come to what we hope is a safer place as far as COVID is concerned, but certainly for new pandemics as they might arise.
Yeah, well, we've only got 1 minute, and let me just quickly sum up. That was beautifully spoken, Barbara. We've heard from Sonia about the importance and that science, health workers, scientists, they've been the heroes of this story right from the beginning. And we need to support them. We need to make sure that we have the kind of open access and scientific cooperation. We need to make sure that information is available, that's accurate, and that the public can trust. Above all, we need equity, as Precious has said. We need, as Martin Luther King said, all inequalities are unjust, but health inequalities are the most unjust. And then we need resilience. In the end, the only way we're going to get out of this pandemic and prevent the next one is if we're all in it together. If we all reach across our brothers and sisters in our communities, in our nation, in our world, and we all have a mutual hug, and we include Mother Nature in that and have respect for the awesomeness that she brings. In future, for me, the most important thing is next time, let's not just be complacent, but be prepared, and be prepared in a world that is healthy and a world that is just. And thank you, Jamie, it's over to you now. And thank you for giving us this wonderful privilege of being with you.
Thank you so much, Larry, Barbara, Precious, and Soumya. What you've said encapsulates the entire reason why One Shared World exists. And certainly the pandemic is both a tragedy in itself, and it's a metaphor for what happens when we look at our world in terms of us and them, and not recognize that in our interconnected, interdependent world, there is only us and us. And while we need to learn the lessons of the pandemic, we also need to learn the lessons of the virus. Why is the virus successful? Because it's identified the core packet of information that turns all of us into its hosts. We believe that the idea of a world organized more around the mutual responsibilities of our deep global interdependence is an idea that can turn the world into hosts of building a better future for everyone. And that's the connection between the conversation that we've just had about pandemics and public health to the conversation we will have now about climate change and global warming. And it's my tremendous pleasure to welcome Manish Bapna, the president of the Natural Resources Defense Council, who'll be our player coach, Masanda Mumba, the director of the UN Rome Center for Sustainable Development, our friend Raj Shah, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation and former director of USAID, and Andrew Steer, the president of the Bezos Earth Fund, which I'm sure you have all seen made a major announcement just a few days ago. Manish?
Great. Thank you very much, Jamie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Really delighted to welcome you to this incredibly timely session, Climate Change in an Interdependent World. As Jamie mentioned, my name is Manish Bhapna. I'm the President and CEO of the Natural Resources Defense Council. We have a distinguished panel here with you today, Musanda Mumba, Raj Shah, and Andrew Steer. And this session is taking place at an absolutely critical moment in time. We are 38 days from the start of a major global climate summit in Glasgow, United Kingdom. This is the most important global summit on climate since the landmark summit in Paris back in 2015 when the Paris Agreement on Climate Change was signed. And this week is a particularly important week, as most of you know. Heads of state and government are at the United Nations to talk about a wide range of issues, including climate change, food security, and the energy transition. I had the privilege this past Monday of moderating a roundtable with 40 heads of state that was also co-chaired by the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who will be hosting the talks in Glasgow. And the exam question for that meeting on Monday is the same question I'm going to pose to our three speakers today. The question was that the UN's kind of own assessment of where current country commitments are to tackle climate change aren't enough. They would put us on a trajectory of 2.7 degrees. Yet the Paris Agreement argues we must aim for a goal of 1.5 degrees of warming. We have a major gap in ambition and a major gap in delivery. What will it take to actually hit our target? How do we get from here to there? So with that, I'd like to start with Andrew. How goes the battle, Andrew? What gives you hope? What keeps you up at night? Andrew, you might be on mute.
Thanks. Great to see you, Manish, Masonda, Raj. What a treat to be with you all today. Look, since we met in Paris for the big Paris deal in 2015, sort of two things have happened. Thing number one, it's got much, much worse than we anticipated. Climate change is not a future event now, it's a current event. More so than scientists were even projecting. So its storms are more intense, heat is greater, rainfall becomes less predictable, where you have flooding, you have acidification of the ocean. All of these things have now are having an effect, especially on those who are more vulnerable. It's really a moral issue that we have not yet really grappled with. Second thing that's happened, though, is that the whole idea of the Paris agenda looks like it is being supported by evidence. The Paris deal was set up as a voluntary mechanism to say, look, we don't yet have a global governance system that can force a treaty so that you as a nation are obliged to do certain things. We just didn't have the politics for that. So it was really designed as a sort of voluntary idea that countries could put in their own offers, so to speak, and their obligation was to be transparent about that, to report on that, and every 5 years to come back and really have that reviewed. And the understanding was that the first time round, it would be nowhere near enough to solve the problem. And sure enough, that happened. The first set of the so-called NDCs were weak. We're now at the second phase. There's good news and bad. The good news is that over 100 countries have now committed to net zero by the middle of the century. I would not have predicted that, and very few people would. That is better than we had thought. More than 2,000 large companies have made a similar commitment. And indeed, 200 of the largest companies have said, we're not going to wait to 2050. We are going to reach net zero by 2040. This is a much greater leadership than we anticipated, which is good. And perhaps the most remarkable of all is the financial sector, which has traditionally not been a friend of climate action. It is generally, because it tends to be short-term in nature, tends to be very conservative. So banks and funds and so on have generally not helped the environment, not helped climate change. They are now also stepping up. And so we have now $90 trillion of assets under management, which are now committed to go to net zero by the middle of the century, which is quite remarkable. Having said all that, that's a long-term vision, and it turns out it's easier to make a long-term commitment than to actually deliver a short-term plan to get there. And so when you talk about ambition, you will hear some people say, oh, it's fantastic. And that's because long-term goals are clear now. And others will say, we're falling over a precipice, and that's because we are not seeing leadership in the short term. And what Paris is all about is trying to bring together those sort of short-term efforts, which can be in terms of tons of carbon, but it can also be policy issues like we will not allow the internal combustion engine to be sold in our country after, say, 2030 or 2035. So it can be policy issues too. So good news, Manish, bad news.
So Ms. Sanda, let me turn to you. Andrew gave a wonderful kind of state of play on what's giving him hope and what's keeping him up at night. Mm-hmm. Your reflections on what Andrew said and your own thoughts on.
No, thank you so very much, Manish, and lovely to see you, Andrew, and you, Raj. It's really interesting. I would have said that Andrew has actually answered the whole question, but perhaps I'm reminded of this fantastic book by Roman Krznaric entitled "Good Ancestor." I think I'm really, and I stand to be corrected. I don't think that the older generation has been a good ancestor in terms of the earth and planet that we're leaving for the future generations to come. And so in really sort of adding a little bit to what Andrew has said, I mean, let's just talk about lived experiences. I've spent the last nearly 15 years in Nairobi, and when the pandemic hit last year in March, there was flooding all over the Lake Victoria Basin. And you can imagine, as you know, all the news media were talking about, social distancing, etc., and all of that. And please, this pandemic is very dangerous. People were actually being taken into all these spaces, particularly by the Red Cross, to make sure that people that had been moved from flooded spaces were also secure. And we begin to see, and just listening into the last panel, the element of preparedness. And I think this is where we see the intersection of this pandemic and climate change conversations. We saw all those fires in Siberia. We saw the floods in Germany and Brussels. And so this also begins to talk about our collective plight as humanity on the planet. What is it that's keeping me awake at night? I think what's keeping me awake at night is sometimes it's almost like we're having a deja vu moment. How are we slightly going back instead of moving forward? I think with this pandemic has been very telling of our fractured relationship with nature. The fact that we all live in cities, most of us live in cities, how do we connect in terms of our food systems? In fact, I think we're competing space right now with the UN Food Systems Summit, which is happening simultaneously right now. Our very food systems have been detrimental to our climatic and planetary boundaries. And then last thing, what I would like to say, what gives me hope is the young people. I think the young voices, the young people, regardless of the fact that they lack in experience, I think they have in boldness and real attitude to just go, go, go. In fact, when I was at the last COP in Madrid, COP 25, it was fascinating. They were all like, you're either with us or please move out. We're really moving. And they've been the ones calling out, let's keep fossil fuels in the ground. Let's keep those fossil fuels on the ground. Let's think about the innovations, the changes that are really meaningful for our planet. So for me, it's really exciting, and I'm really hoping towards COP26 that we're going to see more amplified voices, more inclusivity. And as we say, with the SDG 2030, let's not leave no one behind. Because what this pandemic has done is that it has really brought about nearly 2008 poverty levels. How do we leapfrog from that? And with the compounding of climate change impacts, how do we rethink how we live on this planet? So I'll leave it up at that.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sanda. Just both how interconnected many of the crises that we're facing are, whether it's COVID, inequality, climate, nature, but then also how interconnected the response needs to be. Raj, I would love for you to pick up on that. I know you had a very seminal piece in Foreign Affairs quite recently that I'd encourage the audience to take a look at. Maybe you could say a few words about all of this.
Well, thank you, Manish, and it's great to be with Musanda and Andrew, of course, who are just great leaders doing such important things, concrete efforts that are making the world better. So that's fantastic. And frankly, that's what we just need much, much more of, concrete efforts that are making the world much better at a time of real crisis. I was reflecting on the reality that in the midst of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill on a boat in 1941 agreed to something called the Atlantic Charter. And they made the determination before they won the war, before they knew the outcome of the war, that we would do some bold things together to prevent the next one. And, that led to the Marshall Plan, where America expended 2% of its GDP to help rebuild Western Europe. It led to the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions that have maintained some degree of financial stability and convergence in the global economy over 8 decades. And it helped set the stage for things that decades later became movements to end poverty and bring kind of justice and equity to the farthest corners of the globe. Just recognizing what One World is all about. We're all connected. And I guess Andrew and Musanda were great in describing the situation we're in. I couldn't agree more. And I think what we need now is a COVID charter. We need to recognize that it's not okay for Africa to have an immunization rate around 4 to 6%, while all the new vaccines go to other parts of the globe. And to recognize that we're facing a decade of potential divergence, and we can do something about it. I would advocate for a few concrete steps that are an effort to do something about it. The first is I think we have to reinvigorate investments to fight climate and achieve development outcomes. It has waned significantly in recent years. The increase in official development assistance during the COVID crisis has been minuscule and totally not up to the task. We should commit to every industrial country committing 1% of its GDP to efforts to fight climate change and invest in development in emerging and lower income countries around the planet. Second, we should ask countries themselves to increase their share of public expenditure. If you look at less developed countries, last year achieved 14% of their economy, of their GDP, as revenue collection and domestic expenditure. That is nowhere near enough, even on a good day, to achieve the SDGs and to fight climate change. Some have estimated, Jeff Sachs has estimated, that you need twice that just to have a serious effort to achieve goals that have already been set. So we've called for a 25% target, that every country on earth should be able to raise and spend 25% in the context of their government spending, and heavily weighted towards the purpose of achieving the goals laid out in the Sustainable Development Goals. Third, the Bretton Woods institutions were incredible innovations when they were created 80 years ago. And you can look at a lot of things created back then and say, wow, that was novel, innovative, and impactful then. And respect that, but also recognize that it's time to reinvent, new solutions. And our team has proposed a few specific actions using the special drawing rights mechanism at the International Monetary Fund more aggressively and effectively, changing the capital adequacy requirements of the multilateral banks to allow for $1 trillion of new lending, and embracing novel new public-private collaborations that actually Andrew has helped design and develop with his colleagues, Gordon Brown and others, that could really change how we think about what public-private can achieve in multilateral finance going forward. Fourth, I think we just need more Gavis, more Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, more public-privates that really make a difference. We're committed at Rockefeller to an effort around a global energy alliance, which we'll talk more about post-Glasgow. But these big problems require science, technology, and private partners to stand with governments. And finally, our fifth part of that proposal for the COVID Charter is just asking the UN Security Council and world leaders in the G7 and G20 to actually hold development and climate enterprises, initiatives, and institutions accountable at a political level. It's not okay, as Andrew points out, to show up at Paris, to show up at Copenhagen, to keep making commitments and then fall farther and farther behind against the goal. So that's what our COVID Charter is, but it's really just a call to action. and a sense of maybe during our own crisis, we can find a boat, look at each other and say, let's make sure this doesn't happen again in a much worse form when climate change really starts to disrupt the realities of our global economy.
Raj, that was great. Thank you for those 5, clear points in terms of an agenda of how to respond to these crises. I'd love to just kind of continue with that flow around concrete things that we collectively need to do to tackle the climate crisis and obviously the intertwined inequality and COVID crises that are connected to it. Andrew, I was wondering if you wanted to maybe jump in a little bit more on other concrete steps you feel we need to take.
Well, there are 2 kinds of concrete things that are needed. There are the kinds of policy changes and investments that just need to be expanded. And Raj, for example, at the moment is leading the charge on the creation of a really remarkable new institution called the Global Energy Alliance that will bring serious philanthropic money to the issue of energy. I don't know whether, Raj, you want to say a word about that, but we just need to get the policies in place, and we need to get the investments in place. But there's also a second kind of action, and you don't need this all the time, but there are certain points in history where you actually do need institutional changes. And again, back to Raj, it takes over the Rockefeller Foundation. 50 years ago, the Green Revolution sort of, incipient like 70 years ago, I guess. The creation that Rockefeller did together with others in creating sort of the consultative group on international agricultural research, really ramping up that kind of thing. Think about, 20 years ago with the creation of the Global Fund, for example, and Gavi. And at certain points in history, you need an institutional change. And my sense is this is such a point, and we're not seeing it. At a time when we need multilateralism to be stronger than ever, it is actually not strong. We're not even seeing, for example, in the multilateral banking system, we're not seeing the multilateral leadership that we need to. The World Bank is a wonderful organization. I spent a good deal of my career there. I love it. It needs to step up and say, my goodness me, this is not business as usual. We actually need to go the extra mile. And it may well be that this is a time, you think about it, next year, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the famous Stockholm Environment in 1972. Stockholm Environment meeting in 1972 created UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. Now, the United Nations Environment Program, which is a wonderful program and has done a great job, could be given more power. The United Nations, what UNDP is doing, fantastic work. We should be thinking about how do they all work together? How could we really seriously increase the resources that they have? And so I sense that we are missing something right now. Now, having said that, I do believe there's wonderful things going on. So, for example, I think we're going to see in Glasgow the bringing together of the nature agenda and the climate agenda in a way we've never done before. And it's really quite remarkable. My organization that I have the privilege of leading is the Bezos Earth Fund. 2 days ago, we announced $1 billion for conservation in support of what's called 30 by 30. 30% of all land and sea to be conserved by 2030. A wonderful initiative. It relates to biodiversity, but it also relates to climate change, and it relates to poverty reduction and social equity. And so bringing these all together makes a huge difference. And we've been working with some other foundations, and yesterday we were able to announce $5 billion for conservation on the part of 9 philanthropies and foundations. So you are getting some pretty exciting things happening. And what we really need to do is ask, so in energy, are we in the right place? Are we accelerating rapidly enough? Nature-based solutions, are we doing the same? What about the built environment, cities? What about energy efficiency? Not really going very well. The way we're looking at things at the Bezos Earth Fund is we're looking at the revolutions that need to take place. We think there are about 50, and that includes getting rid of the internal combustion engine, developing the hydrogen economy, shifting to plant-based foods, and so on. About 50 of those, actually. And what we're trying to do is monitor them. And Manish, you've been heavily involved in this yourself, in the system change lab, the World Resources Institute introduced. We're monitoring those, and then we're asking what is the secret sauce that takes one of those over a tipping point, and can we share that secret sauce with each other? Can we identify the blockages that institutions like ours and Raj's and Masunda's can come in and help remove the bottlenecks so that you make change irresistible and unstoppable?
Thank you very much, Andrew. The critical importance of institutional reform, creation, creative destruction, perhaps, as well as the need for really understanding these revolutions. We only have about 3 minutes left. Musanda, I really would love to come back to you, hear your thoughts on this, and then we'll try to have a final word before we wrap up.
Great. I just want to add to what Andrew has said. The United Nations Development Program really, some of the commitments and the announcement that the philanthropists have made, we have existing structures. We have existing initiatives. For instance, the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, Biofin, that UNDP has really been working on. And let's talk about the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. They are mechanisms that exist. And we are the largest agency within the multilateral system that has, offices in over 150 countries. So that in itself also speaks to the policy and the institutional framing, as it were, in terms of supporting. And lastly, but not the least, UNDP, in fact, announcing today, set up the UN Energy Hub, the UNDP Energy Hub, and to really look at how do we really bring about this change for renewable energy. We have no time to waste, I'm afraid, and the race is on, as we said yesterday in that event, for Nature for Life Hub.
We have just 2 minutes left, so we could go to each of you just one last kind of thing that you're proud of that you'd like to share with this audience. Raj, I'm going to turn to you first.
No, I'll give my minute to Raj, by the way.
No, I'll give
he hasn't had a second bite of the apple.
I know.
I'm good. I think I'll 2 quick points. The first is crisis has always been opportunity if taken up and really forced through. And so we should use the chance to immunize everyone on the planet as a way to build health equity into the global health architecture. We should use the fight against climate change as the path to create hundreds of millions of new jobs. And that's what we intend to do with the Global Energy Alliance. We should use this moment where we respect and understand Earth as a rare asset that needs to be protected to advance initiatives like the one Andrew just described. The second point is private alone can't do it. You got to have strong public leadership. And so I know we feel that similarly, but we got to keep this up, and efforts like One World help mobilize a global community to hold public leaders accountable. Now's the time to be bold, not the time to step back.
We are at time. This has been an incredibly stimulating conversation. Raj, Musanda, Andrew, thank you so much. Just one final reflection. It was about 6 years ago to this date when the SDGs were being finalized in New York at the UN General Assembly. And a few months later, the Paris Agreement was signed. And it was a spirit of kind of inspiration and bold agenda. Incredible moment. But as we think about how to deliver that, I think what you heard today from Musanda, from Raj, from Andrew, is what it'll take in terms of the same creativity around institutions, around policies, around politics, in order to help realize that agenda. Incredibly important moment in time. Jamie, we're very thankful for you for organizing not only this session, but the broader One World Summit.
Thank you so much, Manish. Thank you, Musanda, Raj, Andrew, and all of you, and the hundreds of thousands of people around the world who are joining us. Manish just said it perfectly just now. What this is about is imagination. All of our problems are solvable. The question for us is, will we solve them? Will we have the imagination to find solutions that are scalable, that can reach everybody on Earth? Because the message of One Shared World, the message of everything we're hearing today, is that because we live in an interconnected world, we must recognize that it's interdependence. Recognizing our interdependence must be a foundation of solving our problems. And because of that, we recognize that making sure that we are doing everything to empower and assist the most vulnerable people on Earth isn't about charity. It's about what it takes to build a safer world for everyone within a context of a framework of human rights for all. And for that reason, it's my pleasure to introduce our next panel, which will explore poverty and inequality in an interconnected world and our mutual responsibilities for addressing it. And that includes our player coach, Jackie Chimanzi, the CEO of the African Leadership Institute, Max Frieder, co-founder of Artolution, Seema Jayachandran, professor of economics at Northwestern, and the incomparable Jay Naidu, the former South Africa Minister for Reconstruction and Development. Over to you, Jackie.
So glad to be on the conversation. Jackie, I think you might need to unmute.
A very warm welcome to all our participants from wherever you are in the world. This panel is really on how to leverage our interdependence and our common humanity to solve issues relating to inequality and poverty. And I'm sure, as you all know, because of COVID, due to the pandemic, inequality is on the rise and poverty is on the rise as well. The inequality gap is growing. To discuss this with me, I've got a very esteemed and eclectic panel. I've got Jay Naidu, a former minister in the government of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. I've got Dr. Seema Jayachandran, a professor of economics at Northwestern University, whose research has dealt with developing country economies. I've also got Dr. Max Frieder. He's the executive director and co-founder of Artolution, not Revolution, Artolution. He looks at how art can be used to inform social aspects and to find solutions within communities. So to start off with, I'd like to start with Jay. I'd really like to know from you, Jay, how did we arrive at this moment? And this moment where we desperately need each other, but for some reason we're very intolerant of each other and we cannot seem to work together to find solutions and to find common ground. So how do we solve inequality if we cannot find each other?
Jackie, thank you very much. And it's great to be here on the panel. You know, I'm an old trade unionist by occupation, and so I'm an activist today. So I think back to our own history in South Africa. You know, we had an invincible apartheid regime supported by Western governments with the most powerful army that kept us under repression and control for literally decades. And it's only when people actually lose fear of the government and where government starts to fear the people that we have change. And that change comes about because a majority of people say, we've had enough. This is what happened in South Africa in the 80s, an incredibly difficult period in our history in which a powerful army and regime was brought to its knees because we mobilized ourselves. We organized ourselves from the bottom up. And we built a global campaign where people-to-people solidarity put pressure on Western governments to isolate South Africa. So if one looks at it, in the challenges we face today of poverty, inequality, a rising authoritarianism, the rise of right-wing populism, what do we have? We have people. And if people remain bystanders, then all power rises up to the hands of our leaders. And we become bystanders. And that's the fundamental issue, that we lack the type of civil society activism that we had, that built social movements that are not NGOs, service providers, professionalized, answering more to bean counters that give them money in Seattle or in the air-conditioned offices in London or New York, but actually answering to the society. So here we have a situation where the vast majority of people feel marginalized. They are aggrieved. They don't trust public institutions. In South Africa, even in our lifetime where we fought for freedom, people don't even register to vote because they don't believe in this democracy, because it's been captured. And so in this context where there's a great deal of discontent and we have a leadership that's completely lacking political will or imagination, if we look up, we're never going to find solutions. It's if we look down and we see millions of young people doing things, building the grassroots of a new type of activism, not even the activism that influenced and drove us to build mass movements, but a different type of activism where we build an authentic intergenerational conversation which supports activism, and which we build an accountability of civil society, not to hang out in the UN, conferences in some fancy hotel and earn per diems, but get down onto the ground in the informal settlements, in the factories, shops, and mines, in the rural villages, and organize ourselves. Otherwise, we will continue to move on a trajectory that takes us closer, not just to a planetary crisis, a civilizational crisis, or climate crisis, or pandemic within which our governments are taking away rights that we've earned and won over decades. We will be contemplating the extinction of us as a species, and unfortunately, every other species that we share our planet with. So I think it goes back to the basics. Organize or you starve and you face extinction.
Thanks, Jay. And I'd like to bring Max in here. Based on the work that you do, talk to us about how do you activate people's agency? How do you make people realize the agency they have and to use that agency for change?
I think agency is an incredible word, and I love what Jay was just talking about, that it has to come from the people themselves. There's really no other choice. I think agency is this feeling that whether people like it or not, there's this feeling that there's a constant inequality. And so the question becomes, how can unexpected or unconventional means create that action? So a lot of the work that we do with Artolution is being able to use large-scale murals, building interactive percussive sculptures that are trash and recycled materials that come from making songs, doing performance, puppetry, dance, all as ways of talking about human rights, being able to create action that is able to last, that's able to continue with locally led teams in different crisis-affected communities, working in different refugee camps and different conflict zones. So what we're seeing is when you see the massive disparity, there needs to be dialogues and conversations that can be relatable, that can feel that an intergenerational dialogue is possible. So that can be something where using mediums that might bring out fun, might be able to bring out engagement and excitement, can be a way of bringing people to the table. It can be a way of saying, okay, how can we get the children, the adolescents, the parents, their grandparents, all being able to pick up a paintbrush and have a conversation to paint, or being able to all come together and be part of a performance. And so the question becomes, when this starts at a local level, then how can this happen, for example, in the Rohingya refugee camps, where we have a team of artists being able to talk to people in the South Sudanese refugee crisis in Uganda, and then being able to say, actually, we're dealing with a lot of the same issues of poverty, inequity, of problems that are existing from a very, as you said, Jay, hierarchical type of a stance. And so being able to create a forum where that can exist, where it's really about them being able to have those dialogues with one another. And I think one example of this, in a very kind of specific way, is that we've had, for example, one of the women that we work with, her name was Dildar, and she had severe trauma of losing her entire family, and had shock-based mutism, where she didn't speak for 9 months. And the first time that she spoke, she said, my responsibility is to work with women and with girls to have them to share their stories. And now she's one of our lead artists in the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, the largest refugee camp in history to have ever existed. Right now there's over 1.2 million displaced people from the Rakhine state of Myanmar in Bangladesh, and that she has now been able to be in contact with other women in other parts of the world and starting to tell their stories and saying, how can we use the arts? How can we use performance? How can we use our voices to be able to raise awareness to people all over the world and to each other? So this feeling of combating social isolation, feeling that there's connection, social cohesion, and maybe most importantly, a feeling that creativity and excitement can be a way to maybe break some of those barriers to be able to create something that's really meaningful.
Oh, fantastic. So let's move from art and creativity to economics and policy. Seema, these challenges, are they solvable?
It's great to be here, Jackie. I'm not going to take offense with that little giggle about economics. I think the problems are solvable. Most of the world is living on less than $10 a day, and all of us on this panel and many of the people watching have many more resources. And so, I think there's one reason why it's solvable is that we can redistribute. We as people who are fortunate to have comfortable lives, I think have a moral responsibility to solve some of this inequality. And I think besides just the moral argument, there's a win-win. Just as earlier in the summit, there was conversations, that solving climate change is good for everyone. I think there are many ways in which reducing global inequality and reducing poverty can benefit other people. So yes, I completely agree with Jay and Max that the solutions we are going to be largely from the grassroots, but those of us who are living in other countries can play a role and can benefit. So I think climate change is a good example. Some of my research is on farmers in Uganda who are clearing forests because they can't afford a $50 US hospital bill. And so, if we can solve that problem of poverty, we've also helped solve problems of disappearing biodiversity and climate change. I think another reason we should all be invested in solving this problem of global poverty is just innovation. Many of us benefited from a vaccine that was created by Turkish immigrants to Germany, and there are many more talented people who could be creating global solutions who aren't getting that opportunity because they haven't had a healthy childhood. They're not getting the education they deserve. And so if we can solve this problem of poverty, we can all benefit in those ways.
Okay, great. So maybe over to you, Jay. Seema says it's a win-win. It's obvious, it's intuitive. So if it's so obvious, if it's so intuitive, why aren't we doing it? You've been in government before. So what is the mindset of politicians in approaching these problems to say, I'm the American president, how do I help Africa?
Well, the challenge is that you're leaving power in the hands of men, and particularly men of my generation who should be grandfathers and elders, because they understand so little about technology or the world that young people live in. So I think it's time we push them into retirement, and especially go beyond a liberation struggle mantle that we've been carrying for decades. It's now 65 years old. Take a break, hand over power, pass the baton. So, and I think the second thing is that, the idea of our governments in the past has always been that there will be the independent arbitrator between the interests of the market. For example, in this pandemic, have any of us followed the money? What Pfizer is reporting is that their profits have gone up from 3 billion to 33 billion. So in the context of everything we're talking about, vaccine, who's actually benefited when tens of millions have lost, jobs, have been plunged into poverty? And here we have the wealth of the 1% in the United States during the pandemic has gone up by $1 trillion. So there's something fundamentally flawed with the system. And we have these foundations today that have benefited from the system. It's like apartheid. A white minority benefited from apartheid, then pretended that they knew nothing about apartheid. Just like the 1% pretends they know nothing about climate change and what they did to contribute to the problems. Whereas in Africa, we've contributed virtually nothing to the climate crisis, but we face the consequences. So are we still going to put our hands in the hands of those that perpetuate a dominant Western culture? No. Africa today has 60% of the remaining uncultivated arable land, yet we're an epicenter of hunger. 240 million people in sub-Saharan Africa. And yet there is a massive land grab taking place across Africa by countries and corporates that is displacing millions of women, because women produce 90% of our food in Africa. And the only barrier to them being successful, not just in becoming smallholder farmers, but tackling hunger, is legal title to land, microfinance to put in irrigation, build their seed banks, to put in some type of facility that helps them to preserve their product and to have access to the market and cutting out the middlemen. So these are fundamental issues that we have to tackle. But these don't feature even in the debates in the United Nations. It's about organizing ourselves, and the one advice I give to young people, you question everyone and question everything. And if anyone tells you they have a solution, they're lying through their teeth. We have this unique opportunity to co-create something new, a fundamentally new way of looking at democracy, at international cooperation, at solidarity, at economy, at politics, at family, and ridding ourselves of this toxic masculinity and patriarchy that permeates everything we do. And so until we reach that point and say, we're not fiddling around the edges here, the system is broken, and therefore we need to construct and co-create through an intergenerational, authentic intergenerational debate, a new system. And by doing that, we need to bang on the doors of those in power and not let them float into the stratosphere with their notions of how they're going to solve our problems when they have never done anything in the last decades that we've been going through the problem, to a point where we sit at a precipice of an environmental emergency. And I don't think we have the time to have this political bullshit correctness when it comes to talking to people who are elders and people who hold power anymore.
Okay, fantastic, Jay. Let me bring Seema in. You mentioned something interesting. You talked about toxic masculinity. And Seema, I'm aware that some of your research has focused on gender, right? Can we just talk about inclusive structures and what role they have to play in reducing poverty and inequality?
Yeah, I think what Jay said is not just kind of important per se to reduce toxic masculinity, but I think it's part of the solution to reducing poverty. There's a lot of evidence that when you give money to moms, they help their kids and spend on their kids, and it helps the next generation. And women have wonderful ideas. And right now, a lot of my work is in India, where talented women aren't able to go on to college or have careers, and we can have. There's evidence that when women come into politics, they make different decisions, they govern very well. And so if we can create more opportunities for women, we make the pie bigger. So, I think we should be redistributing the pie, cutting it up differently. But if we can make the pie bigger, that's wonderful. And I think one of the most important ways is to make sure that women and girls are getting the same opportunities as men and boys.
Okay, great. And obviously inclusion takes different forms. So you're talking about gender inclusion. And Jay, I hear you coming from Africa, you speaking about inclusion from a youth perspective. So Africa is the youngest continent in the world, yet we have the oldest leaders. And we need new leaders around the table to co-create solutions because they bring new thinking, new energy, new ideas, right? Max, what does co-creation look like? The co-creation of solutions using your approach and methodology as an artist?
Yeah, I think the inequality that we've seen, which is at this precipice right now, inequality in whether it be wealth, what Seema was talking about gender, and saying how can we use methodologies that are being able to bring up and to be able to rise up voices that have many times not been at the table. And that's something where you were talking about how do we take private sector, public sector, totally grassroots, all of the, let's say, inequalities of these very large hierarchies and say, how do we create a shift in the system, both internal and external, where you're banging on the doors to create a change and from the inside changing policy of how resources are being allocated. And that's something that I know for us with the work we're doing with Artolution, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do you use these large institutions? But really, the whole point is that you can have local artists, especially female artists, being able to come out and say, we matter, what we say matters, and how we're going to say it matters. And being able to have that come to the forefront matters now more than ever before in history.
Okay, great. And just to close, just one comment here from John Neve. He says, if every leader on the planet was a woman, we would all be in a better place. I agree. I wonder why. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to Jamie.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie, Max, Seema, Jay. That was just incredibly important for everything that we stand for at One Shared World, for what we're all doing today. And I think there was a lot of hope in everything that you said, that there is hope we can solve these problems if we actually empower people to solve them. And there was justifiably a lot of anger that we live in this world that's so unfair, uneven, unjust. And that isn't just harming the people who are at the most vulnerable, it's harming everybody. There's a better future, but we should be angry that we live in a world where our solvable problems aren't being solved. And that, I think, leads us, so thank you all to all of you. And that leads us into the next section of our summit, which is now that we've looked at these three different critically important areas, there's a common thread in all of these conversations where we have these global systemic problems that are solvable but not being solved. And the key for what we're talking about here and for One Shared World is how do we do a better job of addressing each of these individual problems while we recognize that they each and all exist within a broader framework of a system that makes it extremely difficult for this entire category of problems to be solved. How do we address our global collective action problem, not just as an abstraction, but in a very meaningful and tangible way that helps us solve its many manifestations? And there are no two people I would rather have tying all of these threads together than two very good friends, and I would say part of the One Shared World family, Stephen Hines, the president and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And I should say the Rockefeller Brothers Fund took an early bet supporting us at One Shared World, and we are forever grateful. And my dear friend, Vishaka Desai, who's been part of One Shared World from the very, very beginning, and is the president and chair of the Committee for Global Thought at Columbia. Vishaka and Stephen, over to you.
Thank you. Well, Stephen, Jamie says that we have to be able to do this, what in fact could take years to actually thread together. But it does seem to me that as you and I both heard and have listened and talked to other people, that there are some common threads that show up. And the way I was thinking about it is that our problem is not that we don't have ideas. We have articulated the problem. We even have ideas to resolve or provide solution, but we're still not getting there. So is the problem of will or implementation or both?
Well, it's a great framing, Vishaka. You know, I think it is a problem of will. I think it's also a problem of the incentive structures that exist in our world. And we have, you know, Jay Naidu was just saying in the previous session about how we have invented over time a set of institutions, a set of mechanisms, some systems that have embedded inequality and racism in them, and they have persisted for hundreds of years, and they have a lot of power behind them, and the incentives are all built into that system. So we have this troubling irony. You know, the more evidence we have of the reality of our inescapable interdependence, the less we seem ready to work collectively to address these unprecedented global challenges we face that we've just been hearing about.
Exactly. I mean, it just seems to me that one of the issues is that we can talk about lots of solutions, but if we don't go under the solution of why they persist, they will persist. And it seems to me that part of it has to do with both the last 250 years, if one can get philosophical, that we have emphasized since the Age of Enlightenment in the Western sense, this idea of independence, individual being independent, and then the country being independent, and then each one of it is kind of discrete unit, and you fight for that. Very important idea. But in the process, we have forgotten that in addition to being independent, we are also collective beings. We are also interdependent. And therefore, there has to be some attitude change. And that attitude change, I don't think will occur if the power structures don't really change. Because interdependence involves certain sense of equity. that in fact there's a parity in that interdependence, which we don't have. We don't have parity, as we heard from the last panel, as we heard in the climate crisis, as we heard in the public health crisis. Scientists came together. Soumya described that very well. We succeeded in trying to understand what was going on. But when it fell apart, it's resources that are completely inequitable. So that to some extent, interdependence as an idea also has to involve parity and justice. And those pieces are cultural, social, philosophical, and how are we going to get there?
Yeah. Well, I think this is really the fundamental point. You know, we're facing what I call a polysystemic crisis. The core operating systems that have been in place since the Age of Enlightenment are now proving anachronistic. You know, the carbon-fueled capitalism, the way we practice representative democracy, which is neither very representative nor terribly democratic, and the interstate system, the nation state and the multilateral system, all three of these core operating systems of Western civilization, at least for the past 300 years, are now proving to be anachronistic. And this polysystemic crisis requires what I call polylateral solutions, the kinds of things that the other panelists have been talking about, the interplay between government, business, citizen, civil society, youth, all have to be engaged in, as Jay Naidu and others in the panel before us were saying, co-creating the solutions to these problems. But it won't work even then without a new global ethos of caring and sharing. Values, norms, attitudes, behaviors. And you know, Vishakha, you put it so well in your wonderful book, World as Family, when you talked about the culture of us. And I think that says it very simply, and that's really what we need to get toward.
Well, and as I say also in the book, that our global family is pretty dysfunctional. And we know when families are dysfunctional, they can be also very destructive. And that's where we are today. But it also seemed to me, as David was talking about along with Kevin, that we need all of these players, that I think part of the problem is that each one of those players can do different things at different levels. Our problem is also the connective problem, so that there are lots of good things on the ground at the local level, then some things might happen at the government level, then something might happen at the international level, but the threads don't get connected. And it seems to me that part of the problem is that each player may not be doing the same thing. So when we say global, the world becomes so abstracted very quickly that we don't actually think about each layer might be a little different. It actually, what one might do at the ground level is to push your local leaders and your national leaders to do something. As David was saying, governments are pretty reactive these days. So how are they going to be pushed to look at the us problem and not the I problem? And that, it seems to me, is that it's a different way of thinking about at each layer. We need to think systemically how it connects to another layer.
Exactly. It is, in fact, easy to despair if we only think that governments or multilateral big institutions operating at the global level are the source of our solutions. It's very easy to despair because they seem so dysfunctional. But in fact, what happens in our communities, what happens in our neighborhoods, what happens in our relationships, if we connect it to those larger institutions and mechanisms, can really produce change. And this is where, Kevin Rudd said, governments are notoriously risk averse, and civil society has to be the place where risk is pushed, where accountability is pushed, where creativity is brought to the fore. And I see this happening all over the world in ways that are truly inspiring. Young people and artists and cultural leaders, community leaders, and yes, government leaders, but they're finding that they know they can't do it alone. We have to do it together. We have to do it in new ways, and we have to move quickly.
Right. I don't know if you recently, I'm sure you did, read the piece by Atul Gawande in New Yorker. as I was going across Atlantic, I was catching up on my New Yorker, and his example of Costa Rica was really such a perfect example, where he said that it's one country, it's not very rich, but it brought together the idea of public health and medical together. That medical is reactive, very individualistic. What is your problem? I'll solve your problem as a patient. But the public health, to put that at the front and center, which is where I thought the I and the we come together, because public health is about systems. But it all began with individuals who were working on the ground. They made the change and made the government change and showed the result. So these are the examples. We have to almost think about, let's create some best examples of how people are changing mindsets and policies and attitudes that actually create something that is visible, no matter what the level is. Then we can get to the global.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a good example of that, there are two really good examples. One was the Paris Climate Conference, and Banish Bapna and Andrew Steer were talking about this earlier. You know, Copenhagen, the previous conference, was a failure, and Copenhagen relied entirely on the intergovernmental framework. But by the time we got to Paris, we learned that the governments weren't going to be able to move and act. And so Paris really elevated the role of civil society and the private sector. And it was because of that elevation that the governments then responded. And so we ended up with a much better agreement in Paris than we might have. And now, as we get ready for Glasgow at the end of this year, we have to push the level of ambition. And this, too, is the role of citizens and civil society. So much of this rests in the hearts and minds of all of us as individuals and our role in these big questions, in these big systems. We shouldn't think that we don't have a role. In fact, we have to think we have a very, very important one.
And that's where the young people come in, as I want to just have a shout out to all the young people who are involved with One Shared World, because you all are making a huge difference. And without you, we couldn't do what we do. Jamie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Vishaka, and thank you, Stephen. That was just a fantastic conversation that encapsulated so much of what we all stand for why we're here. And Stephen's point, both of your point, is just essential. This is not the kind of problem where we can just be passive bystanders hoping that our governments will fix this. We all need to be part of solving this. And that's why with One Shared World, with the work so many of us are doing, and frankly, with the work that everybody who's joining this summit represents, it's all about empowering. It's all about agency and multiple voices and multiple empowerment. It's an all hands on deck moment for humanity, and shame on us if we aren't making it possible for everybody to lend a hand to building this kind of safer and better world that we believe in. And that's why I'm so honored to transition now to our next conversation, which will be with some very important panelists who are refugees in camps around the world. And to introduce that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our friend, Stella Suge, who's the country director for Film Aid Kenya. Well, she's coming at some point. Yep. Stella? Well, while we're waiting for Stella to come live, I'm just going to reiterate where we are in the course of our summit. We've had these conversations about these big global problems that are solvable but aren't solved. And now here is Stella as we transition to the next phase of our conversation today, which is really about solutions. Stella?
Thank you very much, Jamie. Film Aid Kenya is very pleased to share with you the voices from our community of refugees from Dadaab and Kakuma refugee camps here in Kenya. The last 18 months has really shown us that we are interdependent. And for us to harness our mutual responsibilities to solve the global challenges, everyone's voice is important, is critical. You will hear from these young refugees about their thoughts, their ideas, their hopes and aspirations, and how, if given the opportunity, they can make the difference and change the world.
the greatest challenge that I face is being a refugee. I've always struggled with labels, and actually being told or being called a refugee, it doesn't sit right with me, because there's more to me. I'm just not a refugee. There is more to me than just being a refugee. I feel like what people can do is to, whenever you call someone a refugee or you learn that someone is a refugee, you should not pity them or look at them with pitiful eyes, because that does not help us at all. Once we're given the opportunity to shine and spread our wings and just fly, there is more to us, and people will actually know that we can actually contribute to the economy of the country that we are hosted.
I think the greatest challenge I face, and most of girls or women in Kakuma face, are limitation. I think the best solution is not to be limited, to give a freedom to do whatever you want to do, as long as it is right. Maybe if you limit this girl, you won't know how far she can go. But if you give her that freedom, or if you lift that limitation from her, she can go too far, and she can do something for her and for her family.
The greatest challenge that I face is being limited to travel the world for either businesses or maybe studies or some other opportunities, maybe for adventure. I feel this can be solved if each and every one of us, refugee or not, were given the chance to move freely in this shared world. I think spreading this message to the world, making them be aware of our challenges, the challenges that people face in their life, their daily life, can make this be possible. People who are able to change this situation are not informed of the situation that we are facing here. Maybe if this message can get to them, this situation can maybe change one day.
Thank you so much. Those voices are so important because, as I said, this is an all-hands-on-deck moment. We need everybody. And that, I think, helps transition into our next conversation with a very, very dear friend of mine and of ours, Nader Naderi, who is a human rights activist and a peace activist who was a chief negotiator for the unfortunately unsuccessful Afghan peace negotiations, the former head of the Afghan Civil Service Commission and the Human Rights Commission. Nader, it's really my great pleasure to welcome you to the One Shared World Summit.
Well, delighted to be with you, Jamie, and lovely to be part of this wonderful summit of yours.
Thank you so much, Nader. The world is in deep pain and suffering and heartbroken by what we're seeing in Afghanistan. And it's hard for most of us to even imagine how much pain you and your countrymen are in. So first and foremost, just want to share our collective concern, love, and support for you and your fellow Afghans.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie. This means a lot, especially in the times of difficulties as such, and that's what makes me or people like me to move on, because hearts and souls as beautiful as yours and those as part of this summit is out there, and we are grateful for it.
Well, good, thank you. So we only have a short time for our conversation, but quickly, I would love to get your thoughts, your quick thoughts on the consequences of what's happened in Afghanistan. Where can we go from here? And how can we, a community of people who are committed to building a safer world, recognizing that sometimes that we will have major setbacks, how can we come together to help the Afghan people?
Well, Jamie, if I count an immediate, at least 5 major consequences of what has happened in Afghanistan are there. The first thing is that the state that's been built after so much effort has collapsed. So we do have today a collapsed state in Afghanistan. The institutions doesn't function. So there are some national consequences of these events, but there are also international consequences of those. So the national one, the first one, the state collapsed and the institutions of public sector does not function, at least up until now, a month and so. Second, the investment of the past 20 years of blood and treasure from Afghans, ourselves, and our international partners kind of wasted, and a lot of what we built together is part of it is gone, part of it is at the risk of being lost also, and especially issues related to human rights, to building an inclusive society, a free society, freedom of speech, and all of those are at risk, and especially women's rights that are still a lot of ambiguities, restrictions being imposed. So domestic, but also consequences to shared values and internationally. Third, internationally, what has happened is the potential for the groups, the terrorist and radical groups, have become much more to be more emboldened. The region is at risk at this stage because a lot of radical elements, they've found a slogan and a rallying slogan saying, well, the Taliban have managed to defeat international community, the West entirely, NATO and allies, and the United States. So we can do also. We do see signs in neighboring country, in Pakistan, the similar groups have rose up and challenged the government, did not accept the peace by the government of Pakistan, and raised flags over mosques in Pakistan. So that's another aspect of the developments in Afghanistan. Also, we see other terrorist groups in other parts of the world, as the fourth key element, have gone more encouraged to take initiatives in their own hand. And empowerment of them is a direct consequences of development here. Signs or indicators are all over, from Africa all the way to the South Asia already. And the fifth one, which is heartbreaking, is a humanitarian crisis, this catastrophe at this stage. Within a month, the rate of poverty has gone to 90%, estimated by World Bank. A middle class has already been diminished. So the private sector have collapsed. So to make it short, these five interconnected, both domestically but also consequences internationally, that will have another consequences of refugee crisis, a wave of migration that will affect the West and will affect immediately the region and also the Europe in that sense. Now, the way forward for all of us is, with in the previous panel, Stephen said very well, that we need to care, but also if there are times that of need to share. Caring in that sense, in the case of Afghanistan, is as leaders, those who make sovereign decisions. A key lesson also, those who make sovereign decisions, as an example, the President of the United States made a sovereign decision to withdraw the forces. But there needed to be some level of care for the population, 30 million people there, some level of empathy that what this decision is going to have the consequence, what kind of a consequences this will have for that 30 million people. Not to stay forever, but how to withdraw those forces. It needed an element of caring. It needed an element of empathy. And that's what we learned today, that the horrific scenes that we've seen at the Kabul airport was just one portion of it that was taking airwaves. And the lesson that I can see as part of that, don't only be driven by the airtime and airwaves of the media only, because they may focus on one part of the catastrophe, but millions of other people across that land and many other places that may not get into the airwaves, they're suffering also. And as you say, and this summit says, it's a one shared world. And we need to care, and also to share those parts of pains also, and turn those pains into some sort of collective actions, and to make our leaders to have empathies at times of these difficult decisions when they make.
So thank you so much, Nader. As much as I would love to just keep going with you, because your message and who you are and the way that you've lived your life, I think is a model for everything that One Shared World stands for. And what you've just said about the universality of these principles of care and compassion and human rights, if we want to have any hope of building that better future, it has to be built on those foundations. So thank you so much, Nader. And now I would like to introduce just a very short video produced by the brilliant Danny Garcia.
Every grain of sand is connected to a life force older than the continents.
The reality, interdependence is not a choice. It is our survival.
Please join us in One Shared World. Lend your passion, your expertise,
your love,
and help our world thrive.
Together, we can surmount our challenges and succeed in our goals.
Business is the linchpin to our future prosperity and existence. However, environmental and social actions by business must now produce outcomes measured in months and years. It's time for quarterly reporting to adopt explicit ESG and sustainability standards as rigorous as required accounting standards. And this can only be achieved with collective action driven through a mindset of interdependence. I would like to introduce Ajay Banga, Executive Chairman of MasterCard and global leader in technology and financial services, to speak of a philosophical framework upon which we must build this mindset of interdependence.
Thank you, Jim. It's an absolute privilege to be here with you all today at the One Shared World Summit. Now, here's my message for all of you. Business as usual is over. Now, that is clear by the fact that we are meeting virtually today. 18 months in, the coronavirus continues to disrupt lives and livelihoods, and it has upended the day-to-day realities of how we conduct business. We can no longer take for granted things like face-to-face meetings, handshakes, or even the opportunity to make deals while breaking bread. But far more than that, we can no longer take for granted the wider range of social supports and systems that have helped the private sector along the way, from the childcare that allows our employees to focus on work for a few hours each day, and the educational systems that develop our next generations of leaders at pace and with great depth, to the small businesses that are collectively the world's largest employer and contributed to life in a million different ways, to the trade routes that move medical supplies from one point in the world to another, and the trade relations that smooth and speed their way, and so much more. I think what the pandemic has shown us is that our lives are deeply interconnected. What affects one impacts us all. It has also laid bare painful truths about just how vulnerable we really are when it comes to social inequalities, climate change, and economic exclusion. So when I started by saying business as usual is over, what I'm really saying is that we cannot go back to the way things were. We cannot go back to a time when we saw these fragilities on the horizon, and we either said, wouldn't it be nice if you could help out with that? Or worse, we looked away because we thought they didn't have anything to do with us or our business. The truth is, they have everything to do with our business because they impact people. And as leaders, it is incumbent upon us to strike the right balance in a triangle of considerations. On one side, there's one versus many. This is about how we act inclusively. On the other side, there's humanity versus nature. This is about how we address ecological issues. And at the foundation of the triangle is the ultimate question of long-term versus short-term. This is about how we put the incentives for action and possible impacts into perspective. We are all part of an interconnected system. And once we see that, our responsibility becomes very clear. For the private sector to help the world navigate the months and the years to come, and help construct a stronger, safer, more sustainable future, I believe we need to do three things. The first one is take care of our employees. Our people are the engines of our innovation, the guardians of our service, the foundations of our companies. When we take care of them, they take care of our business, our clients, the end customer, their families, their communities. Creating policies and taking action to empower them starts a cycle of empowerment and growth that supports business in a multitude of ways. And that, for me, is where real stakeholder engagement begins, with our own people. Second, make commercially sustainable social impact part of our business model. Our greatest challenge for the foreseeable future will be to actually do, to get things done, and not just continue on as we did before, but to find within us the business models, the capabilities, the strategies to support the systems that in turn support us. We need to step up as the merchants of peace and prosperity because we have the ability to unleash the forces of innovation, of creation, and the motivation to drive solutions with both business and social impact. And third, partner for long-term impact. Today's CEOs have made commitments to reverse the harmful effects of climate change while limiting further impacts on our environment. They've made commitments to deliver opportunities for meaningful livelihoods and to drive sustainable economic growth. Delivering on these commitments in a meaningful way is not something any one CEO or one company can do alone. Our partnerships, our collaborations make us all stronger and much more resilient. They offer us the chance to bring our strengths together to create an impact far greater than the sum of its parts. The next decade will be shaped by the quality of these partnerships we develop and the systems we create to enable a recovery that places resilience at its core. My hope is that we can build a new business as usual, where collaboration and trust are the expectation, not the exception. I hope you will all join me in putting our shoulders to the wheel and making this a reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, AJ, for that inspiring discussion. I'm very pleased to kick off a discussion about water, sanitation, hygiene, and pandemic protection, or One Shared World's WashPAC campaign. And I'm honored to have two distinguished panelists. I will start with Caterina de Albuquerque, who unfortunately has to depart a little sooner. And she is the CEO of Sanitation and Water for All Global Partnership and the first United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights to water and sanitation. And Naina Lal Kidwai, the former chairman of HSBC India, who we will speak with in depth in a moment. Caterina, what do you see as some of the barriers in the global system to full access to water, sanitation, and pandemic preparedness for all, in spite of international agreement on development goals? And why does it matter that the UN recognized water and sanitation as basic human rights?
Thank you, Annie. Thank you so much. And thank you to One Shared World for organizing this event and for the opportunity that you are giving us to be here today with you. And warm greetings from Lisbon. Your question would demand from me to be here and talking for hours. But since time is short, I will try to go straight to the point. So the intersections, Annie, are undeniable. Water and sanitation are indeed great connectors, something everyone absolutely must have, and without which so many of our other aspirations and goals, including all of the Sustainable Development Goals, will be unachievable. When we think about pandemic preparedness, imagine if the world had already achieved universal access to water and sanitation 18 months ago when COVID struck. Imagine that all people had access to facilities to wash their hands properly, meaning less people would get sick. Imagine also that they had access to water and sanitation inside their dwellings. They wouldn't have to leave their houses and expose themselves to the pandemic, it would also mean that health facilities would have access to water and sanitation. So with the preventative power that clean water and sanitation brings, people would be more resilient, and the knock-on effects for communities and economies would be massive. Of course, we know this is not the world we live in. The most recent figures from the UN tell us that there are 2.2 billion people without access to safely managed drinking water, and 4.2, as a footnote, this is over half of our population, lack access to safely managed sanitation. 3 billion people cannot wash their hands with water and soap, when this is something that we have been preached about, bombarded with, the need to wash our hands with water and soap to stop COVID. About a quarter of health facilities in the world don't have safe water. So when it comes to gender equality, without access to water and sanitation, women and girls are missing out on school and also on work opportunities, as they are forced to travel long distances in search of safe water, because they need to care for sick relatives, or stay at home while they are menstruating because there are no appropriate facilities at school, or because they don't have the money to buy a tampon or a sanitary pad. So the barriers we are seeing, it's not a problem of engineering. It's not a problem of lack of knowledge. We do know what needs to be done. Closing the gap to achieve universal access comes down to a matter of political will and of leadership. We have examples like India of the game-changing impact when decision makers decide to prioritize water and sanitation. Significantly, with political prioritization, we see a shift in how resources flow to support strong systems, good governance on water and sanitation. And we know also that this is a wise investment, because for every dollar invested in water and sanitation, we have at least a fourfold return in savings in health, but also in better economic and educational outcomes. Beyond the fact that ensuring access to wash is a smart political and economic choice, and as you mentioned, Annie, these are basic human rights. And what does this matter? Understanding water and sanitation as rights is a paradigm shift, which means that these are not matters of charity, but inalienable rights with corresponding obligations of states. This means that states are accountable to demonstrate how they are taking steps to constantly move towards universal access, because that's the legal obligation. It means that decision makers, who often come from, and we know that, the most well-off part of society, cannot turn a blind eye on those in society who are marginalized and excluded, as is often the case, because these people also have these rights. They belong to everyone without discrimination. And additionally, it means that people are entitled to participate in discussions about how water and sanitation are delivered and maintained. Understanding water and sanitation as rights also provides an important framework to support a groundswell of activism to demand the political action, which I was referring to just now. So I think that appreciating water and sanitation as human rights is absolutely indispensable. And I do believe, and I've seen examples of how it makes a difference and changes the world. I think I will stop here.
Thank you so much. I do understand you have another pressing obligation. I really appreciate your participation today and your leadership on this issue. I do want to introduce Naina Lal Kidwai. She is, as I said, the former chairman of HSBC India, and her interests in water, sanitation, the environment, and empowerment of women are reflected in her role as the chair of India's largest industry chamber's water mission. And she's also the founder and chair of the India Sanitation Coalition. And she's authored 3 books, including a bestseller, Survive or Sink, an action agenda for sanitation, water, pollution, and green finance. Naina, thank you so much for being with us. You have achieved many advances with the India Sanitation Coalition in the face of considerable obstacles. In your experience, what are some of the elements of successfully addressing this complex set of issues? And actually, I think we spoke about this. What kind of sharing of best practices is the most effective?
Annie, thank you. And I'm delighted that you have a segment at this One Shared World on the very important issues of water and sanitation, which Katrina has so articulately put forward. I just want to pick up where she left off and remind the audience that India's achievement in the last 5 years, and we're really proud at the India Sanitation Coalition to have been a partner, but just a very small part of that huge exercise that the government embarked on, which took our rural coverage from 40% access to toilets to virtually 100%, certainly in the 90s, and all in the space of 5 years. And the second big achievement was through the behavior change that came through very active communication, which happened through government channels, it happened through NGOs, it happened through communities, it happened through children. And the power of communication, as you at One Shared World are in fact using through the youth, is so effective. I saw it myself at the village level, with children out there telling us why they're washing their hands and how important it was that they wash their hands, why it was important that they use the toilet. And they were bringing their parents into the picture. So this whole exercise of communication at the village level, through skits, theatre, art, stories, through big advertisements that the government put out, and Bollywood films that themed on this subject, all brought the behavior change over the last 5 years. So let's, to answer the question of what is it that enabled all of this, you heard Katrina rightly point out that political leadership, in fact, our Prime Minister, within 2 months of getting elected from the ramparts of the Red Fort on our Independence Day, and I almost fell off my chair because I just started the India Sanitation Coalition and I thought this was going to be this big uphill battle. But he announced what is called the Swachh Bharat Mission, the Clean India Mission, which was primarily on the theme of sanitation. And of course, water is intimately linked with it and not very far behind. So ownership at the top, which meant every ministry aligned, and it made the job of those of us in the NGO type of communities really just push against an open door. And that took a lot of the pain that is normally involved with engaging with governments in some of these areas. A second big area was communities. I don't think any program succeeds without communities. And the communication I mentioned earlier was a critical part of reaching out to communities. But NGOs play a key role as well because they handhold the community. And it's those partnerships between communities and government, local government and citizens that helps to take government activity forward. A third area was informing citizens. Why is it that you are washing your hands? Why is it important to go to the toilet? Why should you have a toilet in your home? So again, the power of communication to deliver those messages, but citizens have to own the program. And one of my favorite ones there is, in fact, the question that I like to ask is, do you know where your shit goes? Because what's happened is we've had this amazing program where we funneled all the shit into toilets. But if that is just finding its way back into fields and drains because we're not treating the sewage, we really would have gone through one of the most expensive exercises in history without achieving what we need to achieve. So the treatment side, the sewage treatment, whether it is down at the rural levels through distributed STPs, as we call them, sewage treatment plants, or larger government-provided plants, we need to address it at the whole fecal sludge management space. And then I would just add that it's important to look at everything through the gender lens. It's not just me speaking because of my work in women empowerment, but you want to make sure that women are central to a lot of these changes. And they were in the case of sanitation, because women went into the fields, they were raped, they were hit on. It was highly dangerous to have them out there. So the fact that the toilet was now at home, it became a matter of pride for a family to be able to provide for the women in the family. So looking at things through the gender lens also becomes important. And I would just say that COVID highlights everything in this space, because at the end of the day, if we have a health issue in a large country like India, you can be sure the world is going to be infected. We have to ensure that the world has one standard for health, and one standard can only come with provision of water and sanitation in every country.
Thank you so much. I mean, thank you for these inspiring words. Thank you for your activism, where you are working in a field that you have seen tangible results, which we all sort of dream about. And also for adding in the private sector to all of the elements that you just mentioned, which is essential. So you've spoken about community, and I'm afraid we have to turn our segment over to a really amazing video that will illustrate what you're talking about. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Great. Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Annie. And Annie will come back in just a moment. And thank you, Nina, for the partnership with the India Sanitation Coalition, which, as you'll hear in a moment, has been absolutely critical for the work of One Shared World. As Nina and then Annie mentioned, this is all about community. How do we build communities of change? And if we're imagining global systemic change, it has to range from a villager in the most vulnerable communities in the world, from the smallest water well, from the smallest toilet, to the halls of the United Nations and beyond. And for that reason, One Shared World has been collaborating with our partners in Footsteps Bangladesh to go and visit a small community and a small vulnerable community in Bangladesh and ask them about what they think needs to have happen to address the global problem of WashPap for all. Here's the film.
Shamima Begum is returning home after fetching water from a tube well just a few minutes away from where she lives. Until recently, she was traveling 2 kilometers every day to reach the nearest tube well, which was functional only occasionally. A few years ago, this might have been just an inconvenience, but today, it could cost her and her family their lives. The absence of water, sanitation and hygiene, or WASH in Kushtia, has massively intensified the spread of COVID-19 and left locals like Shamima ill-prepared to fight it. As in other densely populated, highly unequal countries, infections have swept district after district and then spread across the globe, reaching geographical, political, and societal boundaries. This is why WASH is inextricably linked to pandemic protection, or PAP. In the past, localities like Shamima's have seen efforts by the state, the UN, and NGOs to provide WASH through tube wells, toilets, and hand washing stations. But without community awareness and ownership, these facilities have been poorly maintained, forcing locals to rely on unhygienic, subpar facilities for their daily WASH needs. Organizations have rarely consulted locals like Shamima on how to solve the WASH problems that affect them so intimately.
আমাদের এমন একটা পরিবেশে আমরা বাস করি, আমাদের কোনো জায়গা জমি নাই। এই ভূমিহীনে ঘর দিয়েছে সরকার, এই ঘর পায়ে আমরা এখানে থাকি। আমার উন্নতি বলতে নাই, জন কোনো সময় চলে না। এদের দিকে ঘর বাড়ি পায়খানা কল এগুলা সারার কোনো অর্থ নাই, এই জন্যই সারা ভাঙি চুরি পড়ে থাকে।
এখানে ধরেন 50 ঘর বসতি আছে, এখানে বসতি 50 ঘর থাকলে তার ছেলে পেলে দিয়ে অনেকগুলো ধরেন প্রায় 150 মতো লোক আছে। আমাদের কল আছে 2টা, এই 2টা কলে অনেক সমস্যা আমাদের, মানে কেউ কাউকে বলতে পারে না, বলতে গেলে ধরেন ঝয় ঝগড়ায় মানে নিজের মতো দাঁড়ায় থাকি একজনের কাজ করার একজনের দাঁড়ায় থাকে, একজনের ব্যবহার করার একজনের দাঁড়ায় থাকে, এমন ভাবে ধরেন আমরা চলাফেরা করি। আমার 2টা ছেলে, আমার হাজবেন্ড, মেয়ে আছে। হাজবেন্ড টুকটাক কাজ মাজ করে, করোনার ভিতর থেকে ব্যবসা মানে পুরাতন কাপড় চোপড় বেচতে, এখন আর বেচতে পারে না, মানে বন্ধ হয়ে গেছে। আমার ছেলেটা কাজে যায়, ভ্যান ট্যান নিয়ে ধরেন চাবি টাবি গাড়ি পুলিশের নেয় বলে মারধর ভাই দেন, কোনো কর্মের পথ এখন আপাতত বন্ধ।
Without an understanding of the local context, interventions have been disjointed, flawed, and ill-fitted to people's needs. By August 2021, Kushtia alone had seen nearly 16,000 COVID cases and over 600 deaths, numbers that could have been far lower had inclusive WASH-PAP interventions been put in place. But even when excluded from pandemic response efforts, communities have driven their own solutions. In Kushtia, things took a turn for the better when a group of young locals came together with district authorities to address the threat that the pandemic and poor WASH-PAP pose to people's lives and livelihoods through interventions tailored to local needs. This small group of locals offer us a new way to think about fighting the pandemic through targeted solutions that harness local wisdom, unite stakeholders at all levels, and empower communities as equal partners. COVID-19 does not discriminate by nationality, race, gender, or class. This makes ensuring WASH-PAP for all our strongest line of defense against the current and future pandemics.
আমি লাস্ট 5 ইয়ার সামাজিক কার্যক্রমের সাথে যুক্ত। আমাদের এলাকাতে আগে থেকেই ওয়াটার ও স্যানিটেশন হাইজিনের অনেক সমস্যা ছিল। তো এই কাজগুলো করতে গিয়ে দেখি যে আমার এলাকাতে আরো অনেকেই এই ব্যাপারগুলো নিয়ে কাজ করছে। তো আমরা নেক্সটে সবাই একত্রিত হই এই কাজগুলো করার জন্য। তখন করোনার দ্বিতীয় ঢেউ চলে আসে। এরই মাঝে আমরা দেখলাম যে করোনা বিষয়ে সচেতনতা, গণসচেতনতা বৃদ্ধির কাজ করা দরকার।
আমার বাসা আশ্রম প্রকল্প 2-এ করোনাকালীন আমরা যে কিভাবে মাস্ক ব্যবহার করব, বাইরে থেকে আসার পরে পোশাক পরিচ্ছদ করব এবং হাত ধুবো, এগুলা কেউই জানতাম না। আমি ওদেরকে এক জায়গায় ডেকে উঠান বৈঠক করি, আমাদের মতো করে আমরা যতটুকু পারি উঠান বৈঠক করে তাদেরকে বোঝাই।
আমরা যখন তৃণমূল পর্যায়ে মানুষের সাথে কাজ করতে গিয়েছি তখন দেখেছি বিভিন্ন দাতা সংস্থা এবং সরকারের সঠিক পরিকল্পনা ছিল না পায়খানা এবং নলকূপ স্থাপনে। আমরা এই প্রান্তিক জনগোষ্ঠীকে নিয়ে বিভিন্ন জায়গাতে টিউবওয়েল স্থাপন করেছি। এর ফলে সরকারের যেমন লকডাউনটা সঠিকভাবে বাস্তবায়ন হয়েছে, একজন মানুষ আরেকজন মানুষের বাড়িতে যায়নি, এতে করে করোনার বিস্তারটাও কমে গিয়েছে।
এমনকি টিউবওয়েলটা ভাঙা ব্যবহার করতে করতে এমন সময় হয় কি হুট করে পানি চলে যায়, কিংবা দুইটা নাট নেই, এমনকি ডানটি ভেঙে যায়। এবার ওইটা তো সারতে হবে। 10 জন একটা কল ব্যবহার করি আমরা। এবার ওই 10 জন মনে করেন কেউ 20 টাকা দিল, কেউ 10 টাকা দিল, কেউ 5 টাকা দিল, এমনকি কেউ দিতেও পারে না। এমন অবস্থা, টাকা উঠানোর পরে আমরা কলটা সারি।
And efforts to address this multifaceted problem can only succeed if our policies, programs, and problem solving involve a wide spectrum of political, economic, and social actors. If locals like Bappi, Lippi, and Rahim are supported nationally and globally in driving local solutions. As humanity faces its greatest pandemic in a century, the message being sent by the people of Kushtia must be heard. That one person's vulnerability puts everyone at risk, and the safety of one Shamima Begum is key to the safety of the global community. This makes ensuring WASH-PAP for the world's most vulnerable not a matter of charity, but the smartest investment we can make in a safer collective future for all. COVID-19 has left over 4.6 million dead, with new variants originating and flourishing in nations with poor wash facilities. Today, Shamima no longer has to travel for miles to access water. But how much protection a small community intervention can offer her and her locality against another wave of the pandemic remains to be seen. Globally, over 2 billion remain deprived of WASH-PAP, with little effort to engage those most affected by its absence. With an end to COVID nowhere in sight, a new approach has never been more urgent. Because we live in one shared world and one interconnected ecosystem, we must become one united humanity. The time to act in unison and with determination is now.
That was incredible. And I think, we feel a call to action. And it's good to know in our next session, we're going to be hearing from 4 dedicated and amazing young people who heard that call and responded. They're going to talk about their work leading a collaborative effort to draft a United Nations General Assembly resolution, an innovative resolution that takes a new approach to solving these tough problems that you have been hearing about. So they are Sandy Gendy, who is a law student in Canada, Meenakshi Madhupan, who's a law student in the United Kingdom, Zoe Fisher, a college student in the US, and Peter Ulrich, a master's in public health student also in the United States. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you so much, Annie, for your warm welcome. I'm Sandy Gendy, and I work with One Shared World as the Director of Global Leadership. Now, you might be asking yourself, what is WASHPAP and why should I care about it? Well, WASHPAP is all about guaranteeing safe drinking water, safe access to sanitation and hygiene practices, as well as essential pandemic protection for everyone on Earth by 2030. Now, we decided to focus our mission on WASHPAP because following our Rise or Fall Together report, we've noticed that we're only as safe as the most vulnerable populations among us. And in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've realized that the pandemics can transcend borders and boundaries. And therefore, this is the smartest investment we can make in our collective future that unites us all together. Now, we've taken these goals and we sort of translated these principles into action. Last year, our goal was to get the G20 to recognize WASHPAP 2030. And we've successfully done so when they've included our language in their communique. This year, we're taking it one step further. And we're really pushing and working towards a UN General Assembly resolution endorsed by the G20. I am so honored and proud to say that this has physically manifested itself. Our UN resolution is officially released and you can see it on our website. We took several steps to getting to this point where we're at right now. We've had partnerships with MUN Impact, with multiple students, hundreds of students worldwide, in multiple languages. We've had consultations with the India Sanitation Coalition and the Aga Khan Foundation. We've had meetings with the Special Rapporteur for UN Water. We've had advisory sessions with foreign ministries leading the discussion on WASH. Essentially, we've had all these amazing advisory sessions with leaders in various industries, including the UN systems, NGOs and civil society groups, business professionals, and way more. And that goes to show you how truly interdependent we all are, and how committed we all are to achieving this and guaranteeing WASHPAP 2030 for everyone on Earth. Once again, I'm excited to announce with you all that the UN resolution is officially released and you can see it on our websites. Now here from MUN Impact, Zoe Fisher.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe Fisher, and I'm one of the Global Secretaries General for MUN Impact. In short, MUN Impact is an NGO working in collaboration with the UN Department of Public Information to inspire action and impact for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we largely work within the Model UN community. So traditional Model UN delegates or students represent countries and they draft resolutions that end up sitting on Google Docs or in desk drawers collecting dust, and nothing ever comes out of it. So when MUN Impact heard what One Shared World wanted to do with their UN resolution that actually takes concrete, direct action on the WASHPAP topic, we knew that we had to get involved. And what's so special about the WASHPAP campaign is that it places youth at the center. Youth have bold ideas that are not watered down by politics or the cynicism of experience. And we can see this in the clauses of the resolution that you're going to read shortly, with solutions that have never been proposed by world leaders before. So this collaboration started back in March. MUN Impact got in touch with One Shared World, and we held a series of Model UN debates, attracting over 200 plus middle school, high school, and university students in English, Spanish, Russian, and French. And the students drafted a variety of resolutions after these debates that were then taken and consolidated and edited and consulted with experts to get the final document that you're going to see later on today. So besides helping young people get access to WASHPAP necessities, this resolution empowered so many young students from around the world to actually take solving these issues into their own hands, because youth were involved in this drafting process from day one. So after our Model United Nations debates in March, we wanted to make this even more accessible because of its success, and we changed the model to a discussion or consultation model that was able to get even more students involved in the drafting process. So to talk a little bit more about that is Meenakshi, also from MUN Impact. So I'll pass the mic to her.
Thank you, Zoe. The way the WASHPAP 2030 resolution was created and continues to evolve is through the form of youth consultations held together with partners from around the globe. I work as Deputy Secretary General for South Asia in MUN Impact's university team and also helped facilitate the WASHPAP consultations. Last month, on August 20th and 21st, MUN Impact and One Shared World collaborated with the Indian Sanitation Coalition to organize virtual WASHPAP consultations in 4 major Indian cities. As Zoe mentioned, the first set of debates to help create the resolution followed Model UN procedure, but the WASHPAP India project, after a lot of discussion, we decided to stray from that path because ultimately the aim was to provide youth with a voice on global issues like WASHPAP, which have and continue to affect us all. So we couldn't just restrict this opportunity to students who were familiar with Model UN or lived in big cities. This meant reaching out to those who didn't have that kind of exposure as well. It was at this point in time that consultations came into the picture and replaced debates for the better. From our side, we provided students with guiding questions, which allowed them to touch on different aspects of the WASHPAP agenda, and also assigned WASH specialists for each consultations, essentially experts in their field who helped guide the discussion with their knowledge. Although most of the questions were specific to WASH initiatives in India, the ideas that emerged out of each discussion were such that they could be tailored globally. And it was all the more amazing, I think, because it wasn't just students contributing, moderators and specialists pitched in at times too, which again reinforced that sense of interdependence and the shared stake which we all have in this. Similarly, our most recent WASHPAP consultation took place last week with Global Encounters and the Aga Khan Academies. We had youth joining us from Kenya and London to India, Afghanistan, the United States, and everywhere else in between. In these consultations, with the help of guiding questions again, students had the opportunity to not only add on their ideas to the resolution, but also help improve the existing ideas in the draft. Although we stray from the conventional procedure of creating a UN or Model UN resolution, I think that's the beauty of these consultations, because youth voices come through in their purest form when people aren't just representing countries. Instead, they're using their experiences and backgrounds to express their own opinions. The product of these consultations has quite literally been touched by a lot of hands and minds. And the way we've been able to achieve this from the comfort of our homes makes it even more incredible. As for how exactly the resolution itself was molded into what it is now, Peter can expand on that.
Thanks, Meenakshi. Our resolution starts with a simple premise. The United Nations has made goals to ensure universal water, sanitation, and hygiene by 2030. Since then, many resolutions have been put forth to emphasize this task. And still, many years later, the UN has admitted we will not reach these goals. Now, this is not to suggest that there haven't been meaningful initiatives. There certainly have been. But the reality is our world leaders have failed to make concrete, globally agreed upon steps to accomplish universal WASHPAP. And because of this, citizens within our global community are dying. As a reaction to this, we decided to tackle concrete topics within water, sanitation, hygiene, and pandemic protection to make WASHPAP. Within our resolution, we emphasize several points. First, we need to develop novel methods for resource allocation. Secondly, we need to promote education, advocacy, and culturally relevant training. Lastly, we all need to recognize that our environment and human health are intimately linked. Now, among the other things that we've mentioned in our resolution, we give several examples and direct methods for delivering these concepts. When we talk about these concepts in our resolution, there are several themes that run through it. First is the interconnectedness of our world. We're only as safe as the most vulnerable around us. And this is made especially clear in the pandemic. Our second main theme is that we really do need concrete steps and ideas to reach our goals. This leads to our last clause of the resolution. We set a mandate for every member state, in conjunction with UN Water, to have a full plan by 2022. Then we can begin to roll out these plans by 2023 at the UN Conference on the Water Action Decade. Today, I'm extremely excited to announce the official release of our resolution. This is an 11-page document with 9 primary clauses and 23 subclauses. And you can find this resolution on our website and in the links presented in the summit. Now, while the United Nations General Assembly meets this week, we expect and demand that our world leaders recognize the concepts presented in this work, which represents the voices of youth leaders from nearly 40 countries across the world. Our generation is in a position to inherit a truly tragic situation. We want our voices heard by our leaders today so that we can avoid the potentially dire future. We took input from a variety of countries, a variety of cultures, a variety of perspectives, but in the end, this was a primarily youth-driven initiative with the help of influential individuals. We were truly privileged to have leaders in the UN, leaders in WASH, and a combination of both help us throughout this process. We even had a former chief counsel of the United Nations help us. Now, I expect that many of these leaders were preparing to receive a mediocre document from a couple of teenagers, but time and time again, they would come back to us saying they're blown away by our work. And I'm absolutely convinced it's because we have so many perspectives on this that has turned it into a high quality product. And getting input from different leaders has only increased the quality. So, the piece that we present to you today was a thoroughly vetted piece by experts and received constant input from a variety of perspectives. This has culminated into a document that we have today that we believe can be referenced as a blueprint for delivering water, sanitation, hygiene, and pandemic protection to our global community. And with that, I'll pass it back to Sandy.
Peter, for that. Now, you might be asking yourself, after such an invigorating session on WASHPAP, how can I get involved? What can I do to make this a reality? What are the steps that I can take to make sure I can act as a global change maker? Now, the answer to that is very, very simple. First, utilizing a platform in which you already use in your daily lives. Social media and the power of social media can truly help make this a global advocacy campaign. Using hashtag WASHPAP2030 in all of your posts, adding your own video to the Share the Water challenge, and making sure you educate yourself and your community around you of WASHPAP 2030 and the steps that you can make to directly affect change. Second, call on your world leaders, your government leaders, and your UN reps to guarantee access to water, hygiene, sanitation, and essential pandemic protection for everyone on Earth by 2030. You can also make sure to check out our global advocacy training sessions in which we will showcase to you the steps you can take to make this a reality in your locality or your globality. And finally, make sure to check out this amazing UN resolution created by hundreds of people from various industries, various backgrounds, various ages, and certainly various countries, and see what we propose and demand of our world leaders. Thank you all so much. And I'm going to pass it back to Peter for concluding remarks.
Thanks, Sandy. I want to first thank my colleagues and friends, Sandy, Zoe, and Meenakshi, for presenting today. Next, a big thank you to the rest of our speakers today who support this mission. And most importantly, thank you to the hundreds of youth leaders around the world who contributed to this resolution. We could not have done this amazing movement without you, and I hope you have tuned in to witness the change you have inspired. Next, I'm excited to introduce the Vice Chair of UN Water, Kelly Ann Naylor, who will be receiving our resolution today. UN Water is the United Nations initiative that covers all freshwater-related matters, including sanitation. So please welcome Kelly Ann Naylor.
Thank you, Peter, and sincere thanks for inviting me to participate today. It's an honor to be part of such a vital discussion. As the resolution points out, water sanitation and hygiene interventions and systems have been on the front lines of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet even today, 1 in 5 children globally does not have enough water to meet their daily needs. Nearly half the world's population lacks safely managed sanitation. And at the onset of the pandemic, 3 in 10 people worldwide could not wash their hands with soap and water at home. All of these pose major risks as we fight not only the current pandemic, but prevent future ones. The young people who have joined us today can tell you this from their firsthand experience. They have experienced the impacts of the pandemic and see how changes in climate are affecting water, sanitation, and hygiene in their homes, at school, in healthcare facilities. Young people are now inheriting a world which is becoming increasingly unrecognizable, and the urgency for protecting water, health, and the environment are greater than ever. The young people who drafted this resolution today and millions of others around the world just like them demand our action. As world leaders gather to discuss these important issues at the UN General Assembly this week and in the lead up to COP26 and on to the UN Conference on Water in 2023, we must ensure that commitments that are being made are backed up with concrete action on the ground. Young people are the leaders of today and tomorrow. We must listen to you. We must foster your voices. We must help you unlock and fully achieve your full potential. This includes not only ensuring for meaningful participation in decision-making processes, but also providing opportunities for you to gain the technical skills in areas of water, sanitation, and hygiene to lead this change. We therefore urge all partners, UN agencies, member states, donors, private sector, and civil society, match your support to the level of the challenge that we are facing today on the water crisis. Together, we can reimagine and build a better future for the entire world, for this generation of children and young people, and all of the future generations to come. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to reflect on this important work that you've been doing. The time to act is now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vice Chair Naylor. It is inspiring to know that senior officials at the United Nations see this issue from the same perspective. I'd like to finally, as part of this segment, introduce Binay Jha, a distinguished leader within the WashPAP campaign who will tell us about his exciting initiative.
Thank you for allowing me this privilege of introducing the WashPAP tree plantation program that's part of the One Shared World Global WashPAP Campaign 2030. Just as humanity is interconnected, so are water, trees, and forests. The tree plantation campaign is a living idea, a voice, an effective voice for the WashPAP turned into reality by the amazing One Shared World WashPAP team. We have gone literally to the roots for this. In the last few weeks, we've reached out to people in many countries across the world, from New Zealand to Argentina. And in India, we have reached out to thousands of people in 25 states and union territories. Ram Kali, a woman who makes barely $7 a day, has planted 10 WashPAP trees. A little kid, 2-year-old from Dubai, planted lemon trees and sent photos. Corporates have got involved. A company is getting 180,000 seed balls made every month, which generates money for the women who make it, and that will help to plant new trees everywhere. NGOs are joining in large numbers. Women for Water, an organization in a state, has promised to work with us, planting trees and working on real-time solutions. 5,500 adolescent girls in another state will be the ambassadors for WashPap and the WashPap tree. The best way to fight a pandemic is to prevent it. And this collateral movement of WashPap and the tree is the best means to prepare humanity to stop the next pandemic. So we invite all of you who are watching this program and who will watch it later and who you will be getting in contact with to plant trees, to put potted plants if you cannot plant trees, and upload photos through the One Shared World website. As your WashPap trees grow in numbers and size, they will add to the growing global voice and effort to meet our common challenges, help establish universal WashPap, and help create a clean environment and a healthy future for humanity. Our collective actions today will be the voice that will determine the future well-being of humanity, the earth, and its environment. And as the resolution has just been introduced, as it travels around the world, knocking on the doors of and the minds of world leaders, the WashPap tree will be a speaking tree, bringing people together, working to improve the environment, and finding real-time solutions to our problems. Thank you. Please plant a WashPap tree. Please help bring WashPap to all of humanity, especially the people who are challenged at the earliest. Thank you very much. God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Binay. I wanted to show you I have full of acorns that have sprouted so I can plant these for myself. All right. Thanks again. I'm Margaret Creighton, leader of the World team. Planting campaign is just a number of initiatives that One Shared World has undertaken since it launched last year. And not one of those initiatives would have been possible without young people. From the UN resolution drafted by young people demanding WashPap action to the Call for Hope campaign, which calls on children from around the globe to express what hope means to them through an array of artistic mediums. In these times, when the future is so uncertain, it is incredibly important to allow young people to step into leadership positions, to start taking charge of their own futures. And as a young leader myself, I'm so grateful that One Shared World has given me an opportunity to start shaping the future that I want for the world. I can't think of a better pair, better suited to take part in the next discussion on youth leadership than the two women that we have coming up. We have the fabulous Shagun Sethi, one of One Shared World's directors of global leadership, and Supriya Paul, CEO and co-founder of Josh Talks, a platform working on inspiring and upscaling youth in India.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Margaret. It is such a pleasure and such an honor to be here with Supriya to lead this conversation and this very, very important conversation on how young people can and should be front and center of change making. So Supriya, one of the things, I think about a lot is in a lot of global organizations and institutions, we see young people be the soldiers of implementing decisions. We're not seen as important voices. We're not seen as equal stakeholders. We're not included in decision making. And what tends to happen with that is when decisions are made, young people are seen as volunteers who go on ground and just implement those decisions. As someone who is also a young CEO and founder of such a large level.
Oop. All right, so we're having a little bit of a technical issue. Supriya, are you still there? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm here. I can hear you, but I couldn't
perfect.
hear Shagun.
Yeah, no, me neither. So Shagun was having a small technical issue, but
Sure.
we heard what she was saying. We've talked all day today about these great challenges that we face and how we need to come together to solve them. The only way that we're going to solve them is with youth leadership. And people of your generation have seen what happens when there are solvable problems that aren't solved. Our lives are massively disrupted as they are today. So what steps do you believe that your generation can and should take to drive this leadership? And I'll now drop off and let Shagun step in where I was. But Shagun just asked Supriya to answer a quick question.
Absolutely.
No, of
so I
course.
think, echoing what you said, and as well as Shagun, right? Like, I started my organization when I was only 19, and it's very tough to be taken seriously at that stage. And especially when you're working in the social impact sector, people almost always think that you're running a not-for-profit organization or you're volunteering at an event, or it's tough to be taken seriously. But I think one thing that I've sort of echoed and I would encourage all other young people to do is to be extremely confident and have conviction in their belief and put that across. Whenever you've been given an opportunity to be on a table or have a seat at the table, if you don't raise your voice or if you don't put forward your thoughts in a manner that people will listen, you won't be taken seriously. And I think one of the efforts that we have to take as leaders and as organizations is actually highlight young role models. And I don't see that happening enough, especially at a local and a community level. Even in India, it's always about the 2-3 leaders who get represented worldwide and become famous. But what about people who are creating change at a grassroots level? How can we push them forward in the limelight?
No, that's an excellent point, Supriya. And I think, one of the things that I'm very, very proud of at One Shared World is that one of our, core agendas is to push young voices, young leadership, and young faces forward. And that's why in all different, kind of webinars that we've led, it is completely led. Earlier I do talk about how you actually and we heard Chuck.
All right. So
breaking up.
Yeah. So Shagun, so sorry, we're having just a little bit of a technical difficulty with Shagun. But what Shagun was saying, and not for me to put words in her mouth, but Shagun has just been an incredible leader, one of the leaders of One Shared World as a youth movement, and as Supriya has also said, empowering young people isn't just by giving young people a seat at the table. It's giving young people a real seat at the table, an empowered seat at the table, in order to really drive change. And so, Supriya, I think we're just running out of time for this section. But if you had just one kind of core message of how, in a deep and meaningful way, the voices of young people can't just be included, but empowered, what would that be?
I think, like I said, right, I think it's not just one message, but it's about having a complete circle. So you showcase role models who become change makers, who you take inspiration from. Then you follow that up with, access to information and upskilling. And that's the only way that we can actually, create change together and have a real seat at the table, like I said before.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So Supriya, thank you so much. Shagun, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, yes, perfect. So thank you, Supriya. Shagun, if you would introduce the Global Interdependence Coalition.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thanks, Supriya, for that conversation. It is one of the things that I'm proudest of that I've been associated with is to introduce to everyone the Global Interdependence Coalition. The Global Interdependence Coalition is a gathering of leaders, world shapers, and innovators from all across the world and all different walks of life. We are empowering a nexus of change agents, individuals, organizations, and communities to tackle the greatest challenges that are facing humanity today. Our movement is harnessing our collective capacity to learn, act, share, and teach brilliant ideas to ensure that the basic needs of all people are met today and for all future generations to come. With this, I want to invite everyone who's watching and listening from all across the world to join our movement. You can start by signing the Pledge of Interdependence, which is visible on our website, oneshared.world. And aside from that, connect with us at at oneshed.world/Global Interdependence Coalition. You can join our movement in varying different capacities as coordinators, as interns. You can start your own chapter, which I'll talk about in a minute after you see our video, and also join our global networks. I'm excited to present the Global Interdependence Coalition.
Youth leadership plays a pretty huge role, if not the biggest role.
Like settling into something like One Shared World was so easy for me because I met young people from across the world who are exactly like me. Welcome to the One Shared World Global Interdependence Coalition, a movement formed in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which reminds us of why and how young people can be front and center of change making. We believe that young people should not just implement decisions taken in boardrooms. We believe that young people have voices, opinions, and the correct energy which must be included at decision-making tables. We believe that young people are not the future of the world. We are the present. We are the now.
In the past year, the Global Interdependence Coalition has launched many projects, including our Vulnerable Populations Report, advocacy workshops and toolkits, our Hope Talk conversation guides, and a very special UN resolution with our partners Model UN Impact on the topic of ensuring WASH-PAP for all people by the year 2030. Our projects are expanding into our network of networks, which includes partners such as the Aga Khan Foundation, Carpe Global, and the Global Youth.
There are many different ways in which one can get involved with the Global Interdependence Coalition, whether you're an organization or an individual, a student or somebody starting out their career. We welcome all those from different age groups, backgrounds, countries, ethnicities, and especially those with varying time commitments to give, because only by working together can we truly make a world a better place. We invite all those interested in the Global Interdependence Coalition to check out our website at oneshared.world.
As you can see, and as you can tell, hopefully, this Global Interdependence Coalition is really about having change makers from across the world lead our movements and all our different programs and functions. One example of this manifesting itself perfectly across the globe is how we've had St. Clare College start its own One Shared World chapter. And this is led by Dean Henry Tunido, who has kind of completely led this movement where he's galvanized so many people across the Philippines to lead this movement and spread the word of interdependence. Education and outreach is used as a tool to bring and deliver real change with the example of this chapter. One of their core aims is that in 2021, they want to reach out to more than 30,000 schools nationwide and 40,000 local governments.
Today on Interdependence in Action, building a new framework for solving global problems.
We need to understand that we are one single community. We have, as humanity, a shared destiny.
And saying, let's broaden our perspective and integrate them into a single view.
It's important to make this representation meaningful.
Make them quicker, faster, and share them more.
But we remain vulnerable.
I would like to ask you, Dr. Tedros, what can young people in particular do to help make vaccine equity more of a reality?
Hello there. That was just wonderful. I'm Jackie Davis, and we met earlier with Rachel Cooper from the Asia Society. We co-chair Arts and Culture for One Shared World, and we're very proud to be doing so. And earlier, we announced our 10 global artists for One Shared World. And one of them is Arturo O'Farrill, the amazing Latin jazz pianist and big band leader. He is one of the global artists for One Shared World, and so we asked him to speak about what the work of One Shared World means to him. And he's going to tell us right now, but immediately after, you're going to see a short clip of Arturo at the Wall in San Diego, California. He's playing with his band while musicians from Mexico perform with Arturo's band, but from the other side of the wall. This, for me, is the perfect example of what it means to be and to practice interdependence. Let's have a look.
Soy Arturo O'Farrill, pianista, compositor y educador. La importancia de reconocer que el nacionalismo y el aislacionismo son los enemigos de la humanidad se evidenció fuertemente en la era de la pandemia. Se perdieron innumerables vidas humanas porque la información y los recursos no se compartieron a nivel mundial. Las visitas humanitarias de la Brigada Médica Cubana a Italia en los peores momentos de la crisis son un ejemplo de lo que incluso un pueblo azotado por la pobreza puede hacer en un momento de crisis internacional. Un mundo compartido es un grupo proactivo, energizado y dedicado de seres humanos que buscan activamente cambiar el paradigma de aislacionismo. El trabajo que han hecho, el trabajo que han sumado y la promesa que tienen creará un futuro mejor basado en ver la humanidad como una familia global que está interconectada de maneras que apenas estamos empezando a realizar. Gracias.
Amor sin fronteras, amor es
This all began when I read about a librarian who started a music festival at the border between the United States and Mexico.
¡Que viva México!
He invited us to join him to sing, perform, and dance. And that wall built to divide us was transformed into something that unites us. I fell in love with this idea of people coming together using the primal connection of a Mexican folk music called son jarocho.
Despierta, patria, despierta. Despierta, patria, despierta.
This is not just a story. It's a vision of a world full of hope, friendship, and love.
Incredible. I think that is a perfect metaphor for what we're doing here together. We recognize that this world has walls, but those walls are products of our imagination. And the bridges that can overcome those walls are also products of our imagination. And what One Shared World is all about is not just imagining that better future, but of coming together to build it. We've had more than 3 million people touched by our broadcast and our communication, our interaction today, which is incredible. But there are many more people out in this world who need to feel this message of hope. And we certainly hope that all of you now feel you're part of the One Shared World community. What we've heard today isn't just abstract ideas. It's a call to action, a responsibility for each of us to play our role in whatever way, at whatever level, to build that better and safer future for everyone. We hope that you'll be inspired to take some really important steps. You've heard from the incredible young students about the WashPap 2030 initiative. We hope that everybody will join that effort. You can do so by going to our oneshared.world website. You can read the resolution, you can post and share about it, you can reach out to world leaders, and you can join a process of negotiating next rounds of this resolution, because we are going to have a process of continually growing, of demanding, as Peter said, not just that world leaders hear our call, but they respond. And this means leaders at every level. Again, it's the responsibility of all of us. We heard from Binay about planting a tree for WashPap. We heard from so many leaders about what it's going to take to address the global issue of climate change. And we've seen the refugees in camps around the world, the people in Kushtia in Bangladesh. We are all part of a single human family. We all have a role to play. As I said earlier, this is an all hands on deck moment. And so we will be harming ourselves if we don't empower everybody to be part of this solution. Again, we hope you'll take action. We hope you'll share information about One Shared World. One Shared World is a movement, and it's a movement of people. And to do that, we hope that you will go to our website, oneshared.world, and you can actually use the QR code in the top corner of your screens now, but you will sign the Pledge of Interdependence. That is your way of joining this movement. It also makes it easier for us to reach out to you, to engage you in all of these processes. As I said earlier, One Shared World is an entirely volunteer organization. We don't have a single professional, full-time staff person. We don't even have part-time staff people. We only have volunteers all around the world, the incredible, passionate people who've put our event together today and who you've heard from. So incredible thank yous to all of you for joining. Huge, I can't say it enough, thank yous to our amazing team at One Shared World and Mateo. If you would show the names of many of the people who made today possible. It's really just incredible. As you can imagine, a lot goes into putting something like this together, doing it with all volunteers, young people who have trained themselves in not just how to put something like this together, but how to lead the kinds of global initiatives that you've heard about today. We have some incredible sponsors and partners. And so here's a list. I will read them very, very quickly. So Jim and MJ Margraf, who are sponsors of this event, and very generously, they have offered to do a matching grant for any donations made to One Shared World today will be matched by Jim and MJ Margraf. Again, zero of funds that are donated will go for staff or administration. Everything goes into funding the kinds of activities that you've learned about today. So we'd be so grateful. You can go to our website, oneshared.world, for a donate page and to see the donate page. And thank you so much for that. The Ocean State Job Lot Charitable Foundations, which is my dear friend Mark Perlman and his friends and the members of his company are incredibly and family generous in supporting us. Our partners, the 92Y Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact, African Leadership Initiative, AFS International Programs, the African Network for International Education, the Anatla Center, the Asia Society, the Brown Club of Orange County, the Committee on Global Thought of Columbia University, Daylight Communications, that's the amazing Jamie Douglas, Democracy Global, Dynamic Planet, and Kristen Reckberger, Global Youth, India Sanitation Coalition, and Naina and Natasha and Sanjeev and so many others, Internews, the Jitin Chawla Center for Career Development, Model United Nations Impact, and you heard from Zoe Fisher, the National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs, Petanca Advisory, San Jose State University, and Think Inc. This is really just a community. And it's a community where everybody is empowered, and we hope that everybody's voices have been and can be heard. And because of that, we are now, as we end the formal part of this summit, invite everyone to join our inclusive discussion forum. And you can do this very, very easily by going to oneshared.world/forums. And then Matteo has the instructions for how to do this. You use your computer for access. Chrome browser is recommended. Sign in as guest, the word guest. And we will hope that just like at the end of a summit in person, you might go and there would be a reception and where you would get hors d'oeuvres and whatever else you would want. You can run to your refrigerator, grab what you want, but we hope that you will meet there for our discussion forums. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to our incredible team at One Shared World, because the only way we can build one shared world is together.
Just one voice, we raise your name. Oh, hail our dear St. Clare. Inspired by your dreams and aspirations, and goals for all humanity, we lift our voices, raise your banner, proclaim your cause on high. For your achievements and goals are a light to our path, the soul of all wisdom, and you're a model to us, those in need of your light, the hand in the master's touch. Hope of the future lies in our hand, to greet tomorrow's dream. We just one voice, we raise your name. Oh, hail our dear St. Clare. Inspired by your dreams and aspirations, and goals for all humanity, we lift our voices, raise your banner, proclaim your cause on high. For your achievements and goals are a light to our path, the soul of all wisdom, and you're a martyr to us, those in need of your light.